I'm Marina Lafrosia.
And I'm Monica Birch, and this is Summer Reading List,
where we take a look at your favorite,
or maybe your least favorite,
required reading books. So today we're going to be discussing Lois Lowry's dystopian classic, The Giver.
The Giver.
So once again, we're going to go ahead and start off with our memories and past experience of the book, and if we had to read it in school or not. So do you want to start us off, Monica?
Well, according to The Giver, I don't have any memories. Just kidding. That was a really lame joke. If you read The Giver, you'll understand how lame that was. But no, I actually don't have any memories of The Giver because I never had to read it. Just like 1984, it was another one of those classics that I always wanted to read.
Kind of skimmed past somehow.
No, it was never required for me.
That's what I'm saying. Like some teachers
I thought you meant in class skimmed it.
Yeah, you were just like,
no, I like to read
I
the books.
Never.
It's like, no. Although I do skim books, I'm not gonna lie to you. But yeah, it's one I wanted to read. People have talked about, I feel like it's one of the few that always had, across the board good reviews. So I was interested.
Yeah, that's true.
But that's it. What about you?
Yeah. Okay, so I actually did read it in school. Mm-hmm. So in 7th grade is when I read it. So I was actually probably about the same age as Jonas, maybe a year older. So that kind of is interesting.
Weird, yeah.
It's kind of the same as when I read Percy Jackson or something like that, how you're the same age as the protagonist. So it kind of takes on that extra meaning for you.
Yeah.
At least when I was rereading it now, obviously I'll get into that in a little bit, but thinking about 12-year-old me reading this was very interesting. I don't know. It's you lose some of that introspective being older, but then you gain other, things that you're...
I think there's part of you as a 12-year-old that probably didn't pick up on.
Right, obviously as an English major, you can pick up on many other things that you didn't pick up on as a 12-year-old, but then when you're 12 and you're yeah, that's me, it's kind of different than when I'm reading it as an adult, judging the actions of a 12-year-old child.
I think every single episode we're going to have a moment where one of us says we're an English major. And one day we're just going to make a giant compilation of, I'm an English major, I'm an English major. Are you an English major? I'm an English major. As an English major.
As an English major and a literature minor.
Mine's education minor, so you're definitely going to hate me.
But yeah, so I actually did have to read it in 7th grade.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, my teacher actually had this cool thing that was it was a list of books and you got to choose 4 throughout the years. And so I think it was either the first or second book I picked, so it was the first semester before Christmas that I did choose to read The Giver. And so then, you just read it at your own pace, and then there was a day that we had the test, and every single book on the list had their own test. So,
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I did that in 7th grade, and I remember really loving The Giver, especially, like I said, because you kind of connect with someone who is the same age as you as a protagonist, especially. But I kind of feel obviously, we did read a lot of dystopias growing up. We were kind of right at that age where the dystopias kind of blew up, and that was a big genre for the time. But I do feel maybe this is one of those books that was kind of one of the first. Obviously, 1984 is older. Yeah. But this is one of the first contemporary dystopian novels.
Because there are a lot, but they're just.
I would say there's a lot that fall into the 1984 category of
But you're putting this closer to Hunger Games.
Yes, I would say this was a book that kind of launched the genre that became the Hunger Games dystopia.
Or it's us with the generations, since we're on the borderline of Gen Z and millennial.
That's kind of true, yeah.
And it bothers us for some reason because we
are
that kind of stuff.
The youngest millennials, and we will take no criticisms. We are not Gen Z.
Not that there's anything wrong with Gen Z.
Yes, I feel Gen Zs are cooler than us.
Gen Z gets
to be honest,
crap than millennials, but for some reason I'm
they are cooler than me, I will admit.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was my personal millennial experience with it.
My millennial experience.
But yeah, so
I had a college professor, actually, I'll say real quick, that did that, where we got to pick our own books, and that was by far.
Oh yeah.
Shout out to Jenny. If you ever watch this, you're an awesome professor. But we got to pick literally any book. It could have been children's books. It's just if you pick children's books, you had to read 20 instead of 4.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then she just graded the essays based on
cool.
grammar and so it was that was fun. Well, I'll talk about that in another series.
Yeah, it is kind of fun choosing your own way. Yeah, I think, and
it's
obviously getting to do that as a 7th grader, you feel really powerful.
Yeah, it makes you want to read more because you got to read what you wanted to read.
I will say definitely. As a younger kid, especially in middle school, I did have a lot of really great English teachers, in those 3 years that are very, formative to you. So I will say they kind of set me on the path to be here where I am today.
I had a lot of great high school.
So, and actually my 7th grade teacher was the mother of my 6th grade teacher.
That's really cute.
So,
no, yeah, I think I think that's also why I like doing this podcast, is because we're picking.
Yeah, exactly.
The book that's coming up,
it's kind of more fun
like...
than when we had to write essays on assigned books.
Also, we're not being graded.
Yes, so it's a lot more fun that way. Okay, so now we're gonna just go ahead and say like if we liked it better, different, or how we feel about it reading it now versus if we ever did read it before. So how do you feel reading it now?
So as I mentioned, I'd never read it, and I had high hopes for it, and it definitely met those hopes.
That's good. That's good.
I feel like if you watched 1984, you saw I didn't actually enjoy 1984 that much.
Yeah.
But like The Giver, I fully enjoyed. In fact, it might like reach one of my like favorites, just because like Frankenstein's kind of one of my favorites. Yeah. But I enjoyed it more.
Yeah.
Just because, and I'll talk about that. I'll talk about why I think I enjoyed it more from like a technical perspective, kind of. Right. But yeah, it was definitely a good read, a good plot, good meaning, easy to understand, which selfishly you want. And I think that's why 1984 is that way. Yeah, because it's like, ugh. And I'll just mention now then, I guess, that's the thing I was going to say is like, again, with Frankenstein 1984, they're much older books. Granted, Frankenstein's way even older.
Yeah, way older.
But they're both like full of exposition and just like talking and talking and talking like I'm doing. But like no dialogue. Right. Where this is a lot of dialogue, I would say. And I think I like when you learn things through dialogue instead of through exposition, which is that like, I don't know if you heard this, but like the show Don't Tell. No. You never heard that? Oh my god, it was like in writing classes it's like drilled into you because it's like you don't want to tell the reader it was cold outside. You want to show them it was cold outside. I see. And it sounds so lame to say it, but it is a little bit more interesting to read those books. Like if there's too much telling, which is like 1984 and Frankenstein where they're just talking about what's going on. Right. In the exposition.
Like how Victor is describing nature for like 5 pages.
Yes. Instead of just like having
to be like, I'm happy or I'm sad.
Yes, exactly. So I think that's why The Giver was easier to read, at least for us, because like that's the generation I think we grew up in. I bet if you were in like the Frankenstein time period, Frankenstein was probably easy-ish to read. But, yeah. So yeah, in all, I like The Giver a lot, and we'll go into more of why.
Okay, well that's good. I would say I actually really love this book. Like I said, I did read it in 7th grade, and I think I read it only a few years later. I might have been like early high school, maybe like 9th or 10th grade, and I just like reread it for fun. But that's probably the last time I read it, so I might have been like 15 maybe, so still like 10 years ago. So I guess the first time I read it was over 10 years ago. Yeah, when we used to actually read books all the time, like for fun, and then I don't know how you get depression as an adult and you don't do anything that brings you joy anymore.
Rip. Or how like, I don't know how we would literally, because I think we both did this, like did not sleep. Yeah. School nights would just read. I would read till like
I would do that thing where like you would read ahead in the book and then they're like, okay, so nobody who's read ahead, spoil it for anybody, and you're like, well, I know what happens at the end, so you're that bitch.
But even like the fun books, like when we had to read Twilight, or when we chose to
reread Twilight 500
or the Hunger Games, it'd literally be like 3 a.m. on a school night when you'd wake up at 5 a.m. and you're like, this is fine, I'll survive.
Yeah. Now I cannot do that. No.
Was reading this at like 10 o'clock and I was like, it's bedtime.
Yep. But yeah, so I actually really enjoyed it a lot, like as an adult. Like I said, it's kind of interesting to kind of think about what mindset I was as a 12-year-old reading this, being like, I can relate to Jonas as a fellow 12-year-old, which is really interesting. I think obviously now that I've given it a little over 10 years, it's very interesting to see like how I think about it now, and like knowing the plot kind of made me like be able to realize other smaller things as I went through it, especially like we talked about, it's easier to read. It's like a young adult novel, so it's easier to digest in that way, so we can kind of like pick it apart a little more and find some of the funner. I just said funner on English podcast. It's fine, it's okay,
we're not graded.
Right.
I'm gonna get on my soapbox, which I will probably do a lot, but this is like my soapbox.
It's a good soapbox.
Yeah,
I know which soapbox you're talking about.
I get really upset when people are against young adult fiction just because it's young adult. Because you're like, oh, that's a kiddie book. And it's like, that's not true. Just because the language isn't crazy impossible. I was about to curse so bad. I really had to just like
hold it in. I've said bitch, so
I know. I was going to go like intense, but it's okay. I'll hold it in as much as possible because it will eventually come out. But anyways, no, it's just, I feel like people think because something's not young adult that it's, oh, sophisticated and blah, blah, blah.
It's kind of the same way that people view anything that teenage girls like.
Yes.
As being inferior.
When in reality, it's like, even reading as an adult, I feel like I got more out of The Giver than out of 1984 or out of Frankenstein combined. Because
right.
I think the good thing young adult novels do is they break it down into their rawest form.
Yeah, I agree.
You heard me say this. And that way it's easier to relate. It's easier to, and like really pick up on the feelings and like,
yeah,
this book really,
I feel like it's easier for us to talk about like the overarching themes or symbolism or things that, I don't know, that mean more. It's easier to dissect that in a young adult novel, which doesn't necessarily mean it's worse by any standard. I think it's honestly, like you said, it like breaks it down to like that better. Rawest form. So it's kind of easier. It takes out the fluff, in my opinion. Feels a little more genuine, in my opinion.
Exactly. I think, and I know some young adult novels don't do that, but
right. There are many that kind of just follow that formula. Yes. That are like, they kind of piggybacked off of the trend.
When you get to ones like The Giver, I think you said it perfectly. It's like you feel the genuine emotion, and there's no fluff or flow or prettiness of writing that gets in the way. It's just like...
I'll say earlier when we were talking about this, I did kind of compare it to like a Disney movie. Like it's very formulaic, that it kind of knows what it's about, it gets where it needs to go, it gets to that plot point, and then it brings you home. And it does that in a very like consistent way. It wraps it up and it lets you feel all the emotions you need to feel, but it doesn't like feel like you missed a beat. It very much hits every single beat it needs to hit, and then it's over.
And also, I know we talked about this earlier, and actually Lois Lowry confirmed this after we read, that things are kind of purposely open-ended so you can fill in the gaps, and then that helps. And I think a lot of young adults do that also.
Yeah, I would agree.
Like, you can put yourself in them, and then that even helps you feel it more. I put myself in Percy Jackson, I put myself in The Hunger Games. I think every good book I like, I've somehow put myself in it.
Especially young adult novels.
Exactly.
I feel like those are very, I don't know, they kind of, not that they help you grow
My mind
up,
is
but,
still a young adult, so.
Right. It's just like all those books that you read in your very like formative years. It's just like those are the kind of ones that stick with you.
Yeah.
I will say like more so than any book that I had to read like my senior year of high school, the books that I had to read from like 7th to 9th grade are those ones that really like cemented in me that I was like, this is kind of what I want to keep doing. Not necessarily like when I had to read like, I don't know, The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway like in 10th grade. Like that wasn't something that I was like, yeah, like that is what I want to do. It was more so like me reading Percy Jackson and The Giver when I was like in 6th and 7th grade, being like, yeah, this is like something I relate to, and then I can see beyond what is just on the page.
Like the regular plot
you can
of
see
fighting.
Beyond, like in The Giver.
Is that purposeful?
No, it wasn't at first,
amazing.
But
but yeah, no, I do think she did like an extra special job of purposely leaving gaps so you can fill it in, you can feel yourself. I even, not to jump ahead, but somebody wrote to her and said, oh, I can't believe that Jonas decided to do this. And she was like, huh, I didn't think Jonas decided to do that. But she left it so
open-ended.
Blank that he could fill in how he would want it to go, and it meant more. So The Giver's a good book, basically.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to say. We enjoyed it very much. And if you've never read it and you're way above middle school reading age, you can still read it. And I think you will get a lot out of it.
I think the message hit me well too. I don't know if it's because I watched the movie Soul at the same time, and they have not similar messages.
Don't spoil. I need to see.
I won't, but like slightly similar of just like live your life, kind of
vibe.
Whole, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you are older than middle school age, I would still recommend it very highly.
Young adult.
Yeah. The Giver is a really great read, and obviously you can read it pretty quickly because it's not super dense or anything at all. It's like about 200 pages-ish of pretty large text. We both read like 100 pages a day. Yeah. And that's not like, we do that all the time because we're crazy English majors. Like, no, Frankenstein in 1984 took us forever. Right, that took us like the entire month that we were assigned those books to ourselves. We
Partly
took like
from
the whole
like
month.
disinterest, but...
Right.
Not Frankenstein.
But...
This was like, you picked it up and you just read the whole thing.
Right, exactly.
A fact that I totally forgot till just now, and I could be wrong, so fact check me, but a professor told me it. Okay. Still could be wrong. Young adult novels aren't always called young adult novels because they have low reading levels or low, can you figure out what I'm going to say?
Kind of. I know where you're going.
Yeah. They don't have that because of their reading level or because of their topic. It's purely based on the age of the main character.
Yeah.
So some young adult novels are really graphic and like
That's
either
true.
Inappropriate or
especially if you go back in time, like we were saying. I don't know, like Lord of the Flies or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the fact that the protagonists are middle school, high school, it's immediately called a young adult. So like I wouldn't necessarily think this one has to be middle school age, but because it is a little bit of an easier read, they can, but otherwise it's only called that because of the protagonist. So that's a fun fact.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about some of the young adult novels we read as young adults, we probably shouldn't have been reading those, whether they were inappropriate,
whether they were banned books or not,
or just or just like really, like you said, Lord of the Flies. I mean, we still should have read that, but
but it's a little messed up. It did mess me up a little bit. Not gonna lie.
They're
we'll
really
talk about
dark
that later when we do that book eventually. But yeah. So okay, I guess we'll get into like the meat of the book.
Well, first, before we get into the meat,
you're right. We gotta discuss the author, which we have a really great author this time.
Yes.
We've kind of discussed her slightly before.
We really like her.
Yeah, but Lois Lowry is a great human being in general. We both kind of read like a few interviews of her. I read like a Reddit AMA with her.
Yeah. I read her her website bio. I missed my finger. And then, if you're listening, I went to point to my own finger, and then I totally missed. But yeah, I read her website bio, and then I actually read her for this book and for, what was the other one called? That is another classic.
The Number of the Star.
No.
The Number of the Star. Number of the Stars.
They both have won Newberry Awards, which isn't that, I could be wrong, but it's like achievement in young adult, I think it says.
Yes, I believe it's young adult.
Most distinguished contribution to American literature for children. So it's basically like amazing young adult.
Yeah.
And I actually read her speech for The Giver, and it was really telling. It could be a good word. She explained a lot about the book, what inspired the book, and so I'll mention some of that because I think it's very interesting and important. So if you have anything you want to say, you can go ahead.
And I will say, like, obviously we just discussed The Number of the Stars a little bit, but we'll probably talk about that book eventually later. I feel like we could probably do an episode on that, or at least include it in another Holocaust book episode. But that was probably
of, like, 3 other books we need to add to our list.
I know, it's just ever growing. But I think I read that when I was in the 4th grade, so that was like probably as a 4th grader, like as a 9-year-old, that's probably your first introduction to like the Holocaust in general.
Well, that's like Anne Frank's diary. That's kind of very that's a very dark topic, the Holocaust, and yet you're reading
and I would say,
not saying
the way that she wrote it, like, I know we were just discussing how she won 2 awards for writing great young adult literature, but the way that she like approached it, and that it was very readable to someone who is 9 years old to understand like all the nuances that like occurred during World War II and like the Holocaust and all the terrible atrocities that went on, like to get a 9-year-old to understand those things out of like one novel that's like 200 pages or less, like, I don't know, like that's insane. And I do think like that's a really worthy achievement, and like I guess that kind of just like tells you who she is as a person, and like all the research she took into writing Number of the Stars, like she did a lot of research, and like all of it was kind of based on like true accounts and like true stories of like, you know, survivors and different accounts that they've had of the experience.
She actually discusses Number of the Stars. I haven't read that one either. Number of the Stars in her Giver speech, which kind of hints at why she wrote The Giver as well. So there's kind of a connection in them, but
which is kind of amazing. But so
she's very good at precision of language.
As you can tell, we're a big fan of the author
within
this
like
time.
The last day or two,
right? Like really researching her. But did you want to talk about a little bit of that, or do you want to save that for later?
I won't say certain things, but there's other things that were interesting, like just to give you a clear a clear background. She's an American author. If you didn't, I believe 1980, George Orwell was British. Duh, he's in London. Had to think about it. The difference, though, like Marina said, this one's newer than the last 2 we read. This was 1983. Yeah, 1983. It was kind of sounds.
You were going to say 1984. It's okay.
Because she won the award.
Orwell's on the brain.
I know. She also won the award in 1994, so my mind was like 4. But so it's much more recent, which might help again with like the understanding.
Right. The diction choices and such.
Exactly. Diction, good word. She lived all over the world because her father was an army dentist. I found that very interesting. Kind of is interesting to the book if you read it, as they're stuck in their one community where she traveled.
You also kind of don't think of anybody being like an army dentist. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's something that I thought was interesting.
Like an army dentist.
You're like, oh, they probably would need a dentist, but I've never thought of that
before.
before.
Like, they go to regular dentists, and it's like, no, you need a dentist, like, on base. Or,
right.
Let's see. So, not to give anything away? Not to give anything away with this book yet. She said herself, all of her books deal with human connection. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know if Number the Stars does that. I do. That's all I
Number the Stars is like, that's huge in that.
And
novel.
You can do a lot with that, but
yeah.
So I just thought that was a good point. And
I can't wait until you read Number the Stars.
Let's see. Some of this I might skip, so we're talking about The Giver because it like gives away.
You can just give like any fun fact if you want to throw that out before we continue.
I feel like most of what I read had to do with The Giver, I will admit. But most of what she said was kind of what we already said, which is like she purposely keeps things open-ended. And she would get a lot of fun letters of like, why did Jonas do this? Oh, I can't believe Jonas did this. And they all said different things. And she's like, oh, didn't think of that.
Right.
Something I'll talk about more later that I think is interesting too is that a lot of people named their kid Gabriel after reading this.
Yes, I was about to mention that.
Like, I was curious, like, why not Jonas?
Yeah, I was thinking that too. And then I was wondering if it was from our generation that the Jonas Brothers became a thing, and maybe that's why they didn't name them Jonas.
Maybe, but I feel like maybe. But they weren't popular in 1994.
I mean, they weren't. But this
maybe it just doesn't sound like a normal. Maybe Jonas doesn't feel like a regular.
I do like the name Jonas.
I do too. After reading this, at least, but I do think of the Jonas Brothers, so it's a little harder.
But in the version that we have, I'm not sure when this version was printed, but it is like it's a 20 years later thing that she wrote, like the introduction.
Yeah,
which now it's kind of 30 years-ish later almost. Yeah, because it's plus a few years. Because that would have been 2013 when it was 20 years, I think. So yeah, she gave like a little intro saying like, it's insane, like all these people wanted to name their children Gabriel after my book, and then she's just talking about like the impact that the book has had on her life and like the world, and how that's continued, and it's kind of all the things we were saying about young adult literature, and she kind of just goes into that a little bit, and just talking about how like thankful she is. I don't know, I feel like you don't really see that with, not that many authors are like, oh my god, they think they're above everybody, but like I don't know, it felt very like personable and like, I don't know, again, like you said, she's very much about human connection, and I feel like she's very good at writing like a connection that I felt with her just from her introduction of a few pages. So I think like that theme kind of carries on from who she is as a person, which is kind of like interesting, that I think like that's great that we kind of do like a little bit of research into the author.
It usually explains a lot about
the books, it really does. Now that I'm noticing, and I never did that in school, so I don't know why, but our
teachers always would. Now that makes sense, because like when you read Edgar Allan Poe, you'd hear a whole thing of his life,
right? But like you can definitely get out of just the few, like I think it's like maybe 4 pages that she has of an introduction, you can feel that human connection that she's talking about, that she kind of strives for in her works. And I don't know, I think that's very important. So if you do have a chance to like pick up a copy, I'm pretty sure this is like the first option on Amazon. I think it's like $5.
We keep getting the cheap Amazon options.
Yeah, but it does have our 20-year introduction. But
also, this is published by the company who I keep trying to apply for, HMH. I need to be an editor, and yet,
if you're listening, hire Monica Birch.
It's not that they're ignoring me, listeners. It's that they have no open positions. But like, I saw that after reading this, and I was like, ugh, hire me. But anyways. I digress.
We can go now. We can get into the meat of the story. I don't know why I chose that word, but it sounds kind of gross.
Do you think they eat meat?
Wow, that's a really good question.
We can talk about that. I thought about it earlier when we were eating steak. I was like, our
pre-show meal of steak and white wine.
God.
Oh, that's like a taboo. We should have been drinking red wine, right, with steak?
I don't know.
We're not classy. My dad would be mad that I don't know that.
I feel like you do drink red wine with steak, but I really couldn't tell you.
Okay.
I think white wine's for fish. Anyways.
Yeah, seafood. Okay, anyways. So let's get into the plot points of the novel. So we're going to kind of go through, like we've done in the past 2 books. So we're going to kind of give a little bit of like the plot points of the novel from beginning to end. And then as we go through, we'll kind of like intertwine some of maybe some themes or symbolisms or any questions we kind of had.
And I have more on Lois Lowry, but it'll pop up throughout. Cause,
like, some of her speech that you kind of want to insert here and there. But yeah, so we're going to go ahead and go through that. And then at the end, if we have any additional themes or thoughts, we will add those in. So
would you like to get us started?
yeah, so the beginning of the novel, we kind of get like a little intro to Jonas. Like you said earlier, it is a first-person point of view novel, which I always do kind of find very interesting. I did write an essay on unreliable narrators, which not that first-person point of view is always unreliable, but it kind of is always unreliable as a narrator. And even though Jonas, as we can see later in the novel and we'll discuss, he kind of has like a very strong moral compass, I would say obviously even just seeing things through his eyes is even biased and unreliable.
I would say something that's good though is like you see his anger, but luckily it's usually around somebody, so they kind of like,
so they kind of can balance it out. Like he can describe how they're
like when he's mad about that specific, I think it might be the climax of the book, I'm not sure.
Right.
And the giver's like, whoa now. And you realize like, okay, Jonas isn't totally, he's not wrong, but he's not right. So it's...
And especially with this novel in particular, which we will kind of discuss here in a second, is that like the way that the society is set up is they don't kind of have any way for them to be unreliable. So I would say actually until he gets his assignment that he's an extremely reliable narrator because of how the society is set up.
I was just thinking the more he learns, the less reliable he probably gets.
Yeah. So I would say to describe the beginning of the novel would be, we have to kind of describe the community and the society that they're in.
The novel doesn't really describe it right away, unlike how I feel like Frankenstein or 1984, some of those others would, where they just like dump it all on you. They bust right
into it.
You kind of learn as you go.
Yeah, so you kind of learn through Jonas, and he kind of explains, I think the first kind of things he's explaining is like the rituals of like, feelings that they share. Yeah,
they have the dinner where they talk about how they felt that day.
Right.
You see the apologies that are required.
Yeah, and I would say it's interesting that Jonas, he goes through a few words.
That's the first thing you see is his precision of language.
The precision of language, which is very important in this community.
Which is ironic.
That he is choosing to be like, I'm frightened. And then he's like, no, frightened is too strong of a word. Frightened would be like when this random plane flew over our community. I'm like 99.9% sure it's frightened because I highlighted it earlier today.
Okay. All right then. Let's see.
I'm pretty sure.
You're joking. Why do I think? I feel like the movie said terrified. That's what we're gonna talk about that later.
He does say terrified later in the novel, I will say.
Yes.
But in the beginning of the novel, he says,
I have Marina something now.
Thank you. Maybe an apple. A red apple, per se.
We look like Snow White.
We do. Or Bella Swan. Your choice.
Really, it's Edward, but...
Oh, yeah, you're right. But, I mean...
Did you...
Yeah. I'd want to be Bella, I think.
Whoops.
But...
Sorry.
I would say, so the precision of language is very specific, and so he kind of says he's frightened, and he remembers when he actually was frightened, and he's like, oh, it's when a plane flew over the community, and it's something we had never seen before. So immediately we're introduced with something that is abnormal to the community, which I think is kind of interesting to start on. So we're seeing like, oh, this is something that doesn't happen. So then you're kind of left wondering after the first like 2 pages, like, oh, so what does normally happen?
And I think that's that show and tell thing I was talking about. I think that's that difference. Like, it's not like he says, we never see planes. It was, oh, why is there a plane? And you can kind of infer they don't see planes. English teachers, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
But yeah, so I would say he goes from frightened, and then I don't remember, there's like 2 other words he kind of bounces between, but he lands on apprehensive, I believe.
It's something like apprehensive.
So then they have a ritual of sharing of their feelings, of like what they felt that day at dinner. And so Jonas is part of a family unit,
contrived,
which is what they call like the
organized
family. They don't ever refer to it as a family until later when Jonas learns some things, but every time they're mentioned, it's a family unit specifically, which is also interesting word choice. But so it consists of a mother and father, which in the novel we only know them as like mother and father. Jonas doesn't ever name them. And he has a younger sister named Lily. And all the children are actually named by like the community and the elders, and they're all assigned a specific name. They can never all have the same name.
Number.
Yeah, and a number.
I think that you can repeat names, I think just not in the same generation.
Yeah, so what it is
they retired Rosemary's name, and that was like...
Yeah, so what happens is, which I thought was very interesting, is that They all have names. There can never be like two people in the community with the same name as one.
Dies, yeah.
Once there is
like the old man,
the
Roberto.
old, which is what they call them, when they go off to live the childless life that they kind of describe.
Have two steps. They have the
the childless and then they live the house of the old. Is it the house of the old or the home of the old? Something, one of those. So they kind of live. It's literally like a retirement center, but like
that actually probably is important. Talking about precision language, because I feel like home and house is very different.
Yeah, it's different.
I want to say it's the house.
I do believe it's the house, but we can double check that here in a second. But so then they move to the house of the old, and then that's when, you know, the children have gone, and then they kind of don't have any...
They can't work anymore.
Access to, like, the outside of the community.
Yeah, it's the house of the old, which is very interesting.
The only place that they are at is the house of the old, and that's the only place that they're allowed to be until they are released, which is, like, when they celebrate their life and they kind of give a description of everything they've accomplished or done. Yeah. So if you're an elder in the house of the old, well, yeah.
If you're an old person in the house of the old.
If you're in the house of the old and then it's the end of your life as they have decided, you get a release ceremony and then they kind of describe your life and all your achievements and then everybody celebrates and then you are released, which everyone has been told is that your release is to the elsewhere, which the elsewhere is just somewhere that's outside of the community. So it's a place that nobody in the community knows, but that is where they are told they are released to.
Mm-hmm. And only the old leaving are usually celebrated being released.
Right.
If a child's released, it's usually sad. Mm-hmm. And if another person is released, it's usually because of a crime committed or by choice, like suicide practically. But
yeah, exactly. So the only people who are really celebrated as if it's like a typical funeral, like those don't really exist in this novel. Yeah, so I would say it's like a happy version of a funeral is the ceremony of release, or so they explain it.
I found it interesting too, they never just like let people die.
Yeah,
it was like, we're done with them.
Yeah.
You're released.
It's kind of crazy. I think it's mentioned very briefly on like a page, but they kind of describe like it's very honorable that they are released before they are using up too many of the community's resources.
Yeah, that's not a surprise.
Which, like, wow. So, like, how old are they? Like, they cannot be that old if they're not using up that many of the community's resources. Yeah. But anyways, so that's kind of what happens. I guess we kind of went off the road.
No, we're good.
But that's kind of, you know, what goes on in the community. You go through, you receive your assignment when you're 12, which is how old Jonas is about to be.
Until 12, you get
you have a ceremony every year until you are 12. And then when you're 12, you're assigned your assignment, which is your job for the rest of your life. And then you do that job until you apply for a spouse, and then you're matched with a spouse.
You still are doing that job.
Yeah, you're still doing that job. And then when you have a spouse, you have to wait 3 years, and then you're able to apply for the children. And the children you get are one boy and one girl.
Either or, order-wise.
Yeah, it can be either one, first or second. But you have to apply, and then you're allowed both of those.
And they're not your biological.
Yes.
Like, you're given, like she said at the ceremony. You're given children,
yeah.
And it's after they're, like, 1. Mm-hmm. Or not 1 exactly, but, like...
Around
after the year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the way we describe that they all have numbers is the number of which they were born. Mm-hmm. So if you're like an earlier number, that means you're born in like January or like February. If you're a later number, that means you're born in like November, December.
I believe Jonas was like 18 or 19.
Yeah, he was early, he said.
Yeah.
So he was probably a winter or spring baby.
Mm-hmm. Probably somewhere in January, one of the first days, honestly.
So, because I think, do they say it goes all the way to 50? I don't remember if they kind of say how many is in each grade, but they kind of all have their little group, and they call them like the 11s, the 12s. Mm-hmm.
So he's technically at this age, he said 11, 19, or 11, 18. I hate that I can't remember.
He's 19. He's 19.
He is 19? Number, okay, yeah. So
I am 99.9% sure.
They're called the age they're at and the number they're born. Mm-hmm. Like... through legalities more than, like people call him
every
Jonas.
Single generation, like the 10s can have a 19, the 9s can have a 19, but he is the 11 19.
And then once he graduates, I don't think he becomes 12 19. I think the numbers don't matter anymore.
Yeah, so once you become a 12, essentially you don't care about your age. Mm-hmm. They describe it as like once you're 12, you're an adult.
And that's it.
And you do have your formal schooling still for a little bit. They actually kind of don't really say how long the formal schooling goes on, but they say it's not very long after you receive your assignment. So I don't know how old you would be.
It could matter on the assignment too. Like I know they have their training, but like a birth mother is obviously going to have less than like the engineers or the lawyers or peacekeepers. Yeah,
so there's a whole bunch of different...
That's Hunger Games. Peacekeepers,
yeah, that is the Hunger Games.
The Justice.
Ooh, okay.
Isn't it like the Justice of the People? No. Ignore me. That's an actual thing.
Yeah, so they kind of all go through their years, and then once they are... Is it 9 is when they start their volunteer hours?
It might be 8. It's 8 when they get their volunteer hours, 9 when they can ride a bike.
You're right. 9 is when they ride their bicycles. Okay, so 8 is when they start their volunteer hours. 9 is when they get their bike. Bikes is how they get around.
Yeah.
There is no vehicles that are
There's only a vehicle ever mentioned once, and then...
Yeah.
And it's the Givers.
Yeah.
He's like an important citizen, so...
Right.
And he's not even the driver.
Yeah. So they get around with bicycles everywhere, and everyone's gifted a bicycle once they are 9 years old. And I thought it was interesting, the thing they kind of say is like one of the only rules. There's like a handful of rules that they're like, oh, well, people always break this rule. So it's kind of, implied that it doesn't matter if you break this rule. And one of them is like teaching younger children how to ride a bike, because the older siblings will often teach their younger siblings how to ride, and then they'll go away from their ceremony with the bike and they'll be able to ride without using training wheels, without using training wheels. And I thought that was kind of interesting because that kind of does directly mirror like current society. There's a lot of laws that people just break because like you're like, it's not as important.
Which is surprising.
Like, if I'm going 5 miles per hour over the speed limit, it doesn't matter.
Or wearing a helmet kind of depends on the police officer who sees you and their mood. And
yeah, exactly. It's like weird little things like that people don't think about, that they're like, that's fine because everybody does it. Which is another interesting thing to think about in context of the book, because the community is so much that everybody does this. So that's how it always is. So the fact that they do still have these kind of little laws that they break is interesting.
I wonder if that gives them some idea of choice.
Yeah, that's true.
Like a mirage of choice or something. So they don't really, but like...
Yeah, like they don't really have the choice in this, but if they wanted to be frisky, they can do this.
Some of the things I found interesting about the ceremonies was like when they're a certain age, we're both sitting with our arms like crossed like weirdos. They get the jackets but with the buttons on the back to teach what was it, intra?
Yeah, so it was at
it's okay, we don't have to know the
I was gonna say I don't know the exact age, but
they have to get
I only know because Jonas's younger sibling is Lily, and she is the one who they described. She's very excited to get her tunic that faces the buttons in the front.
Well, she already had her front-facing tunic. It was that she's going to get one with pockets.
So no, but that's the same thing. When they get the front is the pockets.
They had 2 different years. So you go from... We can totally check this.
Okay,
but they go from
because I thought it was like the same.
There's button in the back, and then the next year's button in the front, and then the year after that is button in the front with pockets. So you can be in charge of your personal items.
I was going to say the way they described the choice of the pockets is that like people are now able to be responsible for their own small items and belongings.
But before that, you have to learn community, and that's why you have to do the back buttons.
Buttons are in the back.
So your friends
and you only learn how to start being independent at like age 8 or 9.
Yeah.
Well, not 9, I think, because 9 is when you get the bicycles, but maybe it was age 8 that you get the front-facing buttons. But yeah, it's pretty interesting that they kind of describe all these crazy things like that. That kind of gives you the idea that like, oh, well, that's kind of cool. Like they have a community, they're all set up, and then they learn how to be independent later, which like, honestly, I would argue is kind of a good thing.
I was just about to say something different about The Giver than I think any dystopian.
Right.
Is you don't hate the way
the idea of it. Yeah.
It's like
the way they describe everything honestly sounds pretty appealing at first.
It's definitely one of those like utopia dystopians.
Yes. I was going to say
like
that.
Hunger Games, obvious dystopian, like P4, obvious dystopian, but like when you read that you're like, this sounds comfy.
And the way that we'll get into it, but like the way that the people who have set up the society and have continued to go on and like, I don't know, implement the society further in the community is like the elders. And so there's like a council of elders, and they kind of
Mm-hmm.
make the rules and continue to follow the rules and push everything.
I feel like even the ones at
It's
this
just-
point don't make any rules.
That's what I'm
really,
saying.
yeah.
Like, they just follow everything that's been put in place before them. So the way that they see it is that this is a utopia, and everything that they do is for the reason of, like, everyone
Comfort,
can be
and everyone's equal.
happy, comfortable.
There's no difference.
There is no awkwardness. Like, the way that Jonas describes, and we'll discuss this, I guess, now, is that they kind of have these things where, like, if your classmate shows up late, which, like, Jonas's best friend Asher does, he kind of says, like, oh, like, I have this formal apology of, like, I was doing this. I was looking at the salmon in the river, and then they distracted me, and now I'm late to school because of that. And then he says, I apologize. And the entire class has to be like, I accept your apology, Asher. Thank you. And so, I don't know, it's very, like, rigid, but in a
They're used
community
to it, so it
sense
doesn't
of
feel rigid
yeah.
to them.
So, I don't know, it's very interesting because, like, the way they describe that is very utopian, I feel like.
Well, I think I thought about it afterwards. I think they get the bikes because it's safer.
Mm-hmm.
Like, a bike accident is totally different than a car accident. So I think everything is about protecting the citizens. And I think that's what's different, too, is, like, in other dystopians, there's usually someone evil who's trying to make it about them and ruin everyone else's life, where I almost get the sense that in The Giver, and this is me projecting probably, but I get the sense that in The Giver, those elders from way back and back and back and back and back, love my little reference there, they were trying to do the right thing.
Right.
They were trying to help people. They were trying
They honestly don't think they are doing anything bad.
Yeah.
Whereas, like you just said, like in some of the dystopians that we're pretty familiar with, you can see that there's obvious, like, malice and, like, I know that my benefit is, like, because someone else is suffering. All the Hunger Games or something.
Yeah,
because
I don't think the elders get special treatment in this book.
Like,
I think
they
everyone
literally,
is actually
it just
the same.
depends on your job. And everyone has already agreed that every assignment has a certain sense of, like, where they belong in the community.
Also, your job does tend to match your personality.
Right. And we can discuss this a little further, maybe in depth later, but it is kind of interesting the assignments they give and how people perceive the different assignments.
That was interesting, too.
Because, like, we were talking about the birth mothers are actually, like, regarded with not so much, like, honor. It's a job that's kind of, like, seen for people who are lazy.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. But,
because they get to lay around for 3 years. And it's
right. Well, they just have children. Like, that's the easiest thing
I was
in the
gonna
world.
say, I mean, unless they do some weird shit where it's like, you don't feel pregnancy at all, but
yeah,
they don't really explain it in the book, so you can't assume.
So, and then essentially they become laborers afterwards, which is, like, as, like, in today's society, service workers, retail workers would probably be, like, what they would call laborers, and those are, like, some of the hardest jobs that
I pictured
exist.
like physical laborers, like builders.
Well, yeah, like, I mean, like, construction workers,
yeah.
like, I don't know, people working to, I don't know, make anything happen in society or keep, like, the grounds of society together. It's the same way that I would feel as we do in a capitalist society view people who are, like, service workers or retail workers, or
which pokes holes in their utopia.
Exactly.
And that's kind of when you start to see, like,
yeah, and you're like, okay, well, that's interesting. Okay, that's how they feel about that. And it's interesting because the way they describe it is, like, that it is very matter of fact. Like, it doesn't hold all those connotations that I was kind of just projecting as, like, people don't respect retail workers.
But they straight up say, like, oh,
yeah, they're like, oh, well, that's just how it is. And to them it really is. And like we were saying, that kind of makes it seem like it is a utopia for them. Like, they don't know any better, which is something that comes up later, but they just really don't know that there's any way else to be.
I mean, I would argue, and I think you could agree with me, that there's no such thing as a utopia.
There definitely is.
There's always, if you think something's a utopia, you're missing something.
Right.
And I think there's some books, like we said, where it's clear dystopia, and then there's others where it's like a utopia that's secretly a dystopia.
Yes,
I think that's this one.
I agree with that.
And I think that's also what was more interesting, is you're like, whoa, this is more crazy than I would have expected. Some of the stuff we didn't talk about yet, I don't know if you want to talk about now, the things they're missing.
You can go a little into detail on that.
So I don't know if this is because it's not really because of the medication they take, so I'm not sure through what way they do it, but they don't feel feelings.
Right.
At least not deep feelings. Like, they'll talk about feelings and they'll say, I'm angry, I'm blah, 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 but, like, they weren't
as
really.
we said, they do have a thing that's called the ritual of feelings. So at dinner,
but it's
the
very
family
surface level.
units will discuss today I felt angry because of this, and then the family will comfort them. They will.
I was
do
angry
whatever.
because I was cut in line. Like, that's the most thing that can make you angry.
And then they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. He shouldn't have cut in line, but I hope you feel better.
And they were like, but did he know he was cutting you? Because did he learn that rule yet? Because he's a kid? And she was like, no.
Yeah.
That's Lily specifically. Yeah. But they don't get, like, deep, real emotions, and they don't know that. Jonas realizes later, and we'll discuss why. They also, and this was a big shock. Do you want me to say this one?
Go for it.
Okay. They don't see any colors. Which you might know that already, because that's kind of a big talked about thing. And that's what kind of sucked for me, is I kind of had an inkling of that's what was going on, just because I've heard about The Giver. But it would have been nice to get that shock authentically. Yeah,
I will say, when I was 12 and read this for the first time, I did not know that that was a thing. And so when you discover that they don't see color, it was like, whoa. Like, I did not see that. But then once you know that, the whole first beginning half of the novel begins to make a lot more sense. Yeah. Because Jonas does have these things sometimes when he's like, whoa.
He calls them changes.
The apple that I was throwing with my best friend Asher, it changed. But I don't know why.
And he wouldn't explain what the change was. He just kept calling
it the change because he didn't have the precise language to describe what that was. And he even asked his friend Asher, like, did you see that? And then his friend's like, I don't know what you're talking about.
You know, that kind of reminds me of 1984 too, because their whole point was to cut down on language, so you would have less ability to feel and to do your own individuality. It's almost like all of those books reached their peak in The Giver. Like, they were able to, they were able to cut down on language, because they only use a certain amount of words. When he says love, they're all like, what are you talking about? That's such like a
it's
antiquated
obsolete
word. Yeah,
is what obsolete. His mother literally calls the word love obsolete.
And they're almost like, what are you saying? But then she says, the father says, like, enjoy makes more sense. It's like, well, so it's much more surface feelings and language.
Do we enjoy you? Absolutely.
Are we proud of you?
Proud of you? 100%. It's like, okay, but those aren't the same things as love.
So it's just very interesting. It's almost like a numbness. Because in order to not feel pain, you can't feel happiness. Right. And I guess the creators of this world decided there's too much pain, so let's just get rid of both. So that it's just like...
I do like that similarity that you drew to 1984, because the language specifically is very, like, 1984 with the precision of language versus, like...
But they would
we have one speak. Yeah. And, when he was trying to make that dictionary that was like, we will only need a few words in the future because we won't need anything. Point. Like, The Giver is what they were trying to get that society to be like in 1984.
Like, plus good. Super plus good.
Yes, exactly.
Bad good.
They were just saying, these words are obsolete and now we use these instead.
So I feel like that's a good... Oh, there's no race either.
Right, because they can't see color.
But even then, I think The Giver even pointed out, even when they could see color, race is eradicated. Not so much like they've killed off people of different races,
right?
But more that they've kind of, I don't know if people have seen, like, how everyone, scientists are thinking in, like, a few thousand years we'll all be the same skin tone just from, like, the mixing.
Right.
It's kind of like they've reached that point, and almost purposefully.
Yeah.
So that way there's no race issues, there's no gender, there's no, like... any sort of difference fighting. Everything's the same, so no one can claim difference. Which is interesting
because Jonas kind of mentions, like, you know, there isn't differences in people. And like I was saying earlier, they kind of have gotten rid of awkwardness in general, because Jonas actually says in one line of the novel that, like, it is rude to point out people's differences and you should never acknowledge them because that is even uncomfortable and rude. And so you're never supposed to, you're never supposed to acknowledge them. And if you do, you have to give a formal apology, and then it's either, you know, accepted or not, as we've seen before. But
I bet that made a weird sound.
Probably did.
Marina slapped the microphone.
But so I don't know. I think that's pretty interesting that, you know, as they're going through everything, and I don't know how else I'm trying to say this. I'm saying everything a lot, but...
They also can't leave their boundary.
Yeah.
They have their, like... I pictured it small. I know it wasn't small, but, like, they literally have their little...
Did you picture it in a dome? Because for some reason I'm picturing it in a dome.
I didn't.
I know that's not how it is,
that's
but...
like a Hunger Games thing you're thinking.
Yeah.
But...
I mean, like, I know there's not a dome. I didn't, like, actually visualize that. But, like, the way he describes it later as he's trying to be like, I've never felt sunshine or weather or, like... they have this thing called climate control.
It could be in
and the way that they describe that, it just made me think of like, oh, they're in this tiny little snow globe that doesn't exist anywhere else.
I feel like the movie might be closer to that idea, so maybe you're right. I mean, they don't show a dome in the movie, but they show like physical boundaries.
Right. That's interesting.
Or like force field kind of boundaries in the movie, which we'll talk more about the movie later. I never pictured it like that. I think if anything, the way I pictured it was more like they might have had like weather controlling things. Like, you know how if you go somewhere up north that doesn't really produce snow, but they want to get skiing money, they'll produce fake snow.
Yeah.
I think I pictured more like that, but the opposite, because they don't get snow, they don't get heat.
Right. They only have like a controlled temperature.
And I think that's what we mean when it sounds like, that sounds nice. Like everything's okay.
Everything is comfortable.
It's not even just like it's like, this is good.
Yeah.
But that's it. It's just
which is
like,
why we're calling it a utopian dystopia.
Yeah. But I think that's a good, like, for the most part, overview of the community. So we can probably move on to like the rest of the plot real quick.
So then we have Jonas's family unit. His father is a nurturer, which is somebody who takes care of the children.
The babies.
Which is, they have a specific name, the new children?
Yeah, a new child.
A new child. So those are the children who come from the
0
birth
to
mothers.
1.
And before they are like a year old, like we were saying. They are nurtured by the nurturers, and then they go on to receive their assignment. And so from their numbers, they are all assigned a name. But they have a child who is a little more difficult. And Jonas's father kind of petitions for him to get an extra additional year and say, oh, instead of having him for release, which is something that happens to like new children who are not able to like reach that threshold of where they should be at like that 1 year mark.
Like behavior. And
yeah.
It's calmness, I think, it was the biggest one. Like,
yeah, like if he can sleep
being
through
able
the
to
night.
sleep through the night.
If that happens, then they have a release of the child, which is like very rare, he kind of says.
Yeah, it would have been his only one that year, so he was really fighting against it.
So he kind of petitions for Gabriel is the new child's name, which he kind of sneaks a peek at the list to see what his name will be.
That's broken.
That's broken, yeah.
You're not supposed to see the names, but he does.
So he kind of looks at it because he thinks that calling him by name will help him, you know.
Which makes sense.
Mature, which is kind of true, because what we know from today's day and age and how you should talk to babies.
Live in a home, not like an incubator.
Yeah. So he takes Gabriel home, and they all have to actually sign like a little like NDA petition kind of situation.
And like it was like a contract that just said like you can't fight to keep the kid once we decide
like you cannot get attached. Every family unit only has 2 children, and once the year is up, he goes back to the center and he goes to a new family.
Yeah.
So
or he's released.
And so they kind of have Gabe in their home.
And the book takes place over that year, kind of.
Yeah, so that whole year is when everything kind of becomes important. Because like we said, that year is when Jonas is actually going to his ceremony of the 12s. And the 12s is when they get assigned their assignment, which is their job for the rest of their life.
And Jonas was not sure what his would be.
Yeah, and Jonas has done volunteer hours at many different locations. He kind of follows his friends around, and his friends, as we mentioned, Asher is his best friend. Fiona is another girl in his class who's kind of like good friends with him and Asher. And she does all her volunteer hours at the House of the Old, like we were saying. So she kind of is I believe it's a caretaker, that is caretaker of the old, which is like the official assignment that she gets. But he kind of does assignment hours with her. He does assignment hours with Asher. He kind of just bounces around.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have any idea of like where he's going to be placed, which is like something he mentioned in the beginning, that he's apprehensive because he doesn't know where he will be in his assignment of the 12s.
Yeah, or if he'll be happy, and you can't change it. I think you'd be released if you change it.
They said you can file an appeal, but then it's kind of a joke. Filing an appeal is like kind of something that the council never sees to. So it's kind of like a little inside joke between the community. But so he tells his father he's apprehensive. His father is like, no, they never get it wrong. Like, I knew I was going to be a nurturer. My friend knew that he was going to be a doctor. Yada, yada, yada.
Lily probably would be a nurturer as well.
Because she's kind of like all
over Gabe.
Yeah. So.
We finish each other's sentences.
Essentially,
sandwiches.
you're just judged on your interest as a 12-year-old and what that will be for the rest of
and
your life.
I think they admit that, like, yeah, sometimes that can be wrong, or did I?
Yeah.
Like,
No,
they admit,
like, you can have the appeals, like I said, but it is kind of a joke a little bit.
like, the idea of playfulness, as a 12-year-old, they go, oh, you'd be good at recreation. You find out it's just, like, laziness.
Yeah.
When you get older, and then it becomes an issue. But that's rare, is what they said.
Yeah, that is rare that they pick incorrectly.
To the assignments, we are at the event. And it goes in order by number. So as we said, Jonas is 19, right?
Yes.
I don't know why I keep forgetting. I think in like the book or the movie, I'm confused.
Okay.
I think they use the right number. My mind's just like all over the place. They go through the order. They get to Jonas.
Right.
And they skip Jonas.
Right. Which never
doesn't
happens.
happen. So what the fuck's gonna go on?
Yeah. And the way he kind of describes is that, like, he was so excited. He was ready. He felt calm.
Practiced his walk at
that
home.
it was now his turn. And then all of a sudden she's like, number 20. And then she keeps going.
And even why do I feel like he is 18? It's gonna bother the crap out of me.
What, like his number?
Yeah.
Like I said, I think I'm 99.9% sure he's 19. But if I'm wrong, everybody can make fun of me later. But, yeah, so the elder, like the person who's in charge, who actually is voted on every 10 years, which I kind of also thought was interesting.
Surprised about that.
But he kind of is sitting there.
I just need to blindly trust Marina.
Oh, thank you. You shouldn't, but
I know.
Thanks.
Mr. What's his name?
Last episode, I accidentally called Mr. Charrington Mr. Covington like the entire rest of the episode after we first
you got it right
him.
this time?
Yes. Because I'm pretty sure Covington is a place in England, and that's why I kept calling him Mr. Covington instead of Charrington. But I'm so sorry for anyone who's a huge 1984 fan. And if you only listen to that episode and you, like, read me, then that's fine. But whatever. Anyways, so in the ceremony, they skip Gabe's number. They go on to 20.
Jonas.
Gabe. I called him Gabe. Oh my god. They skip Jonas's number. Gabe is a baby. He can't talk. They skip Jonas's number. And there's kind of a hush over the audience.
Yeah, even number 20 is like...
Yeah, and the way that he describes seeing the audience is that, like, they've all, like, think that she's made a mistake, but she doesn't make mistakes. Yeah. So it has to be correct. So, I don't know.
Finally, they get to the end of, like, the 50 or whatever. And she even says, you think I made a mistake.
Yeah, and then she apologizes. Yeah, she does, I apologize for causing you stress. So, yeah.
We accept your apology.
Yeah, so then she kind of describes this interesting position that Jonas is in. And she says, oh, every so often we have to pick someone who will be the receiver.
Selected.
Yeah, he is selected, not assigned. Yeah. The word choice, again. Diction will be continuing throughout
probably because
the episode.
Because the giver selected him, right?
Yeah. So he is selected rather than assigned. So he is actually kind of studied for a few years, as are all the children, to figure out what assignments they should belong in.
But for a while, they suspected him to be the giver.
They kind of like bookmarked him to be like, okay, we're going to keep an eye on this kid, that he's going to be the receiver.
And there has to be unanimous.
So they kind of decide that he is going to be the receiver of the community, and what that means is that he will receive all the memories.
Which you didn't realize before that people didn't have memories. So that was an interesting thing about the book too, where it's like, oh, I guess no one has memories.
Yeah. And so the way they close off the chapter when Jonas finally receives the assignment, even though it is his selection instead, she says, thank you for your childhood, which essentially means like, it's over now. So thanks for that. You have to go do this now. And they all receive like a little folder with their training materials. And he was worried because he describes all the engineers and, I don't know, like medical workers, they all have like multiple pages of things they have to look over. And he has one single page in his folder, and it has a few rules on it, which I think we probably should have written down all the rules.
We are more prepared than we sound when we talk. Things come up that we don't think about.
But I will say the big ones that we can probably remember are...
It's going to pop up.
He is now allowed to be rude. He is also now...
He's not told to be rude, but he can be rude if he
like, he's exempt from...
being punished for rudeness.
For being rude. And, what is the one before?
I found it, okay. So he has to go straight from school to the annex.
Right.
Which is where the giver is.
The giver is.
Although currently he's called the receiver of memory.
Yes.
And then he has to go straight home. He then, like Maria said, he's exempt from the rule of rudeness. He can ask any questions he wants, which normally is not allowed.
Yeah, you're not supposed to inquire about anything.
He can't tell anyone about his training. Top secret. Even his parents. He is not allowed to dream tell anymore, because that's another, I think their breakfast ritual is to dream tell. So they talk about what they dreamed of last night, and then at night is when they do the feelings. He is not allowed to take medication if it's going to interfere with his training.
Right.
He cannot apply for release, because I guess people could apply to be released, and he can now lie, which is a big deal, because one of their first rules is don't lie.
Right. So I think it's like he had 7 rules or 6 rules, but the last one specifically is you may lie.
Yeah.
And so then he's like, wow, that does make sense. I'm sure I will never be rude, and I'm sure I will never lie. So these rules don't make any sense.
The second I read him go, I'll never be rude, I was like, boy, you're gonna be rude.
Yeah, so I guess that kind of brings us into like the training that he goes through.
Yes.
And so the training he kind of goes through is he goes to the annex in the back of the House of the Old.
Interesting, they're connected. I couldn't figure out why, but
it's actually interesting. Maybe we could discuss.
There are 8 rules.
8 rules. I was off by 1 number.
I felt like it was 8, but I've been so wrong recently that
you gotta believe in yourself.
Don't.
But he rides with his friend Fiona. As we've said, she has done a lot of volunteer hours at the House of the Old as a caretaker. So she has been assigned that. So they kind of ride together there in the morning, and he goes to the back.
I actually, before we get into this, I want to talk about that one thing that happens with Fiona. And I feel like that was one of the big signs of like, this is a dystopian for me, is when he has a stirring dream.
Oh, right. We didn't talk about
Fiona.
The stirrings.
Yeah. So if
that's right before the assignment.
Yes. It doesn't have to, it's like depends on the kid. Yeah. Just like today, like
it's just puberty.
It's puberty.
Spoiler
basically.
Alert.
He starts to feel romantic feelings, although he doesn't realize the romantic feelings, or like sexual desires, really, more than romantic feelings towards Fiona. Her feet just touched under the table. I couldn't help but say it. But
right. So
he has a dream. It was really interesting. I mean, I don't have to explain the dream that much, but he has a dream because they bathe the elderly together, and then he had a dream that he was trying to bathe her, and he was like, I wanted to see her naked.
Yeah,
and his
he
mom
literally
like,
says, like, I wanted her to take her clothes off and get in the tub.
I was angry she wasn't, but like I understood she couldn't.
Yeah.
And his mom like, oh, that's a stirring, take your pills to like suppress that. And that's when I was like, oh, that is a weird thing. Yeah. Like now he has to take suppression pills, and like they all take it, and he was kind of excited because his friends take them. So he was like, finally I fit in. I'm like, okay. Yeah.
So essentially what those pills would do is just like suppress any sexual desire.
I think like any desire.
Right. So just like any emotions or feelings that you get from, I don't know, going through puberty. Maybe that's, I guess, how
they don't really get the feelings. But...
Yeah, is like, because the wording that they use is the stirrings. So to me, that feels slightly more sexual than like than romantic. Yeah, but you know, it is literally, like I said, just going through puberty as you do as like a 12-year-old, 13-year-old child. But
I feel like it could also stop romantic connections though, because I think it goes back to if there's romantic connections, you might make bad choices. Yep. And then something bad could happen to the community. So they just want to like cut it off. Yep. So that's Fiona.
So the stirrings are just feelings. And so they kind of are like, once you feel those feelings, we can't have you feel those anymore.
Yeah, so here's some more pillies.
Right. And so that is essentially, I would imagine that is the basic reason why they have the telling, like the ritual of dream telling, is for that reason.
I think that's why they have both, honestly, to keep people in check.
Yeah, it is.
Something else I thought, they don't outwardly say it, but they're always surveilled, right?
Right. They have, so, as you'll remember in 1984, they had those little screens that were in every single building and everything.
But they don't outwardly say this in this book.
And so they have them in this novel. And for some reason, I can't remember the exact wording that they use.
Well, they have speakers. I know they mentioned.
I was going to say, I think it's called speakers.
But they were, I know those speakers were also for like when they would make announcements.
Right.
Like,
that
when
is
Jonas
what it
took
is.
the apple. But
so it's not so much like surveillance, like as they are watching you, but they can like listen to what.
In the movie, they are watching though.
Oh, that's interesting.
I can't remember if it was in the house or not, but definitely outside.
Yeah, that's
which I mean that happens now outside, but
yeah, because they mention, as we were saying, Jonas goes to the annex in the back of the House of the Old, and that is where he goes and meets the elder.
At the time it was the receiver of memories.
The receiver of memories. And so Jonas is now the receiver of memories. That is what he's been selected for. And he asks the elder what to call him now that he is the receiver. And because Jonas is kind of trained in precise language, so he asks such questions as these. He asks, and then the old man tells him, I can be called the giver. So that is what we'll be referring to him for the rest of the show. It
always bothers me we never learned his name.
Right.
But whatever.
Yeah.
So I guess we can get into the training.
Yeah.
Real quick of what they did. Basically, the point was the giver the receiver of memories, but the two of them hold all of the memories of like all of time.
Right.
So it's kind of like, think about your history books, but you actually feel the feelings. Like when you read about war, they feel the war. When you read about like even like small things. The first memory Jonas receives is sledding down a hill, and he doesn't just like read about it or see it. He feels it. He feels snow. Yeah. He feels the joy, all of that stuff. And so the entire job of that career, and it's only one person, is to hold all of that and gain wisdom. That way when the council needs help deciding something they've never dealt with before, they can call upon the wisdom
of the giver.
Well,
the receiver of memory.
The receiver of memory.
The giver.
An example in the book is like when the plane flies over that Jonas mentioned.
Right.
The elders, that had never happened before, and the elders were terrified and thought, well, should we shoot it down? And the giver called upon a memory of people prematurely attacking and said, no, just wait, because it could start an unnecessary issue.
Right.
It might not be someone attacking. It could be a mistake. Sure enough, it was a mistake. They avoided a violent situation.
Right.
So that's the situation where they've called upon him.
Right. And then he also kind of says, like, it barely happens ever. Like, it's happened a handful of times in his lifetime that he's been...
Mainly he's just alone.
Right.
Feeling feelings.
Yeah. While nobody else feels feelings with him. So Jonas's training is essentially that he receives all these memories that the giver has been holding. And so the giver, who was the original receiver of memories, he has the memories of pretty much all of humanity.
Yeah.
So just like what every society has done before the community that they now have. And he kind of describes it as like the back and back and back, which is that reference that Monica made
because
earlier.
They've had so many givers and so many council of elders that they can't even think of when the origin of the community is.
So he can't remember when any of these memories
can't pinpoint
were
when these dates are,
actually happening. But he knows it was back and back and back. So it was before the giver that gave it to him, and then the person before them.
It was really before there was a community at all.
Yeah, so it was before they had their utopia. That is not really a utopia.
And I think they show us another thing why Lois Lowry is so good. We see a couple of memories shown, and I think it's very important. She only showed a few, and I think all of them meant something. Like the very first one was the sledding, and it was just like pure joy and bliss. Interesting for us, though, we kind of talked about this a little to ourselves. I wonder if, like, as a kid, you said that didn't really mean much to you, or...
Yeah, so something interesting is that as a 12-year-old, you're a little bit more obtuse when you're reading things. I guess now reading it, like, as somebody who's already read the novel, as soon as I realized that his first memory that he gives Jonas was the sled in the snow, I was like, wow, the ending of the novel makes so much more sense now. Whereas when I was younger, I guess I didn't really connect that first memory and what happens in the end of the novel.
Well, I even just think from the standpoint of, like, we're in a hot climate, that the whole point of this... Yeah, Floridians. The whole point of the sled was to be pure bliss. For us, it's like, that's not really an experience we've experienced. Like, I think I did go sledding. No, I went tubing on snow, not on water, because when I say tubing, I think of water. But I went, like, snow tubing, like, when I was 4. And you said you've never seen
I've
seen
never
snow.
seen snow, so
and
I can't
this
even
book
relate.
kept calling back to snow being like a point of happiness, kind of like. So that was very interesting to read as someone who hasn't experienced snow, but you could still feel it.
Yeah.
But that was just
for
interesting.
sure. I can kind of feel like that, like childlike emotion that you could feel. Yeah, like playing outside.
Enjoying something.
For me, the closest thing would be like playing at the beach, but
which ironically was the first painful memory.
Right.
Was getting a sunburn, which we know.
Yeah, which we definitely know as Floridians. But
I feel like he was on a beach because he was laying down, he was tanning.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, I know that one.
So
which ironic would be my happiness.
Yeah.
For the
so
burn.
Jonas kind of asks like, oh, what like this will entail, and then the giver kind of tells him like, oh, like I'll be sharing memories with you. Once I have the memories and I give them to you, like I no longer have the memories. And he kind of describes it to Jonas as like, I have a wisp of the memory, so he can kind of recall it but not completely. He can't feel all the feelings and he can't see all the colors like he once did before.
And I think he's okay with that because I think he's tired of feeling the pain and the suffering. And
so
Jonas
just
is
like,
willing to
imagine
help him.
everything that you remember ever, including all the history you've learned from decades and decades before you like existed, before you were alive, but for one singular human being. I
thought it was interesting the experience of PTSD because there'd be moments in his training, and Jonas trained for about a year, but there'd be a moment in his training where the giver would send him away because he was in too much pain, kind of like physical doubled over pain. Yeah. And one day he says, can I help you? And the giver agrees, and he shares the memory. And I don't know what war it was, but it wouldn't have been a recent war. It would have been like World War I, World War II, even like way before that.
Something with kind of like more
something guns, warfare, but more like the old style of like trench warfare. Yeah. Maybe not even trench warfare, I don't know. But it was like just dead bodies. And
all over.
They're all dying.
Describe like the horses with their hooves like kind of clawing up at the sky.
Yeah. And a dead body near him and feeling the pain of his own injury, watching life leave somebody. That was a huge scene for me. Yeah. I thought the way she described blood was really good because it was just so... Right. We didn't really talk about it much, but red is a huge point in the book.
So like if we backtrack a little bit, the way that we kind of are introduced to it, like we said, is that Jonas kind of sees something that's called the change, where he notices things that are changing. The first thing he ever notices is an apple. He's playing catch with his friend Asher, and they're throwing an apple back and forth, and he kind of says like, oh, the apple just changed. That's so weird. Like, I don't know why, and I don't know what that means, but it changed. And he notices it again, like we said. The
faces at
when he's at the ceremony.
All their faces
and he
change.
Receives like his selection, he notices their faces in the audience change. And then the next thing he notices is his friend Fiona, who rides to the House of the Old with him.
Her hair changes.
She like kind of flips her hair. How I pictured it is that she's like off her bicycle and she's like, "Okay, bye, Jonas," and she flips her hair. And then he was like, "Wow, her hair changed, but only for a moment." And then he like walks inside and they kind of discuss that. And so the giver is like, "Oh, so I see you've already experienced like the change."
And I think he knew it was coming because I assumed the giver felt that change leaving him.
Right. Yeah.
So I think things were already, and I think that's how he partly knew it would be Jonas. Is because he was starting to feel like, oh, I'm losing things.
Yeah, some
and
of the
this
memories
kid's
were
acting kind of funky.
Yeah. And so when he says that, he kind of describes like, that's not how the change happened for me, but I'll tell you about that another day. Yeah. And we can talk because I don't have the words to describe it to you yet. Yeah. Because like we said, they kind of all have very precise language. Jonas doesn't know a lot of words or things that he's learning from these memories. Like we said,
he learns the words as he's learning, like the words come up with the memory.
So the first memory that he receives from the giver is a joyful one, is that memory of the sled in the snow. So he's on what he learns is called a hill, which doesn't exist in the community, which also does not exist in Florida, so I can relate. But he kind of learns the word hill, and he learns the word sled, and he learns the word snow.
And the sled ends up being red. He doesn't realize right away.
So the sled is red, and he kind of goes through that memory, and he's like, "Wow, that was amazing. That was the best thing ever. And then the giver later, like Monica just said, he kind of is like, oh, recall the memory and see if you can look down at the sled.
Yeah. Like,
and he realizes that the sled was red. And that was the thing that he was seeing was changing. Was that
color?
He is able to now see color.
And the first one he saw was red.
It was red.
So it was a red apple, a red sled. And so back to what I was saying, red hair. And the faces was because the red tones in our skin.
And skin tone, yeah.
So, like, he couldn't see their full faces, but certain faces that tended to be more red or blushing, he saw that red come out.
Yep.
So he didn't say he, like, fully saw the faces. He just was like, something weird flickered there.
Yeah.
But that's what I was saying was so poignant about the soldier was the description of, like, their fresh blood literally just coming out of the soldier. And he was asking for water. And that was one of those moments where it's like, I've never been in that, but, like, holy crap.
Yeah, the way they describe it.
She does a really good job.
Yeah, that Lois Lowry describes it is that, I don't know, there's a soldier who's like, water. And Jonas is like, oh, I'm confused.
And he's never experienced, like, pain or death. He doesn't know
any of this. And then the soldier again asks for water, and Jonas is like, oh, like suddenly aware that in this memory of the soldiers that he kind of has like that option to grab like his little canteen.
But he's injured himself, like his arm's pretty messed up.
Yeah, that he's also injured, and he hands the water to the boy. The boy
who's about his
drinks
age.
the water, and then
dies.
Rolls back and dies.
And he realizes it's not just that boy around him; it's an entire field.
So
he's in the middle of a war.
Yeah, and he feels that he gets the word war for the first time, and he understands what war is. And then I remember at the end of that scene, it is very like prominent that she chooses this for Jonas to be like, "This is the first time I had a different understanding of the color red." Yeah. And that was because of the fresh blood that they describe across the soldier's face and that he sees all over the entire field of war. And so he kind of understands that these colors that he's like regarded up to that point to be so beautiful and associated with like beautiful choices and things.
Red leaves, red
is
hair.
Now something that he realizes could have different connotations.
Yeah, and that everything's not just good and
that some memories are painful.
Yeah. And we'll talk about more about why it's important to know the painful memories, but it is interesting. That was like a big moment. Let's think.
Yeah, so after we get that, we kind of go through more of his training. And Jonas,
he gets more
like
painful
we said,
ones,
he goes through about a year of training. So it's actually right before like the next year ceremonies.
Right before Lily gets her bike.
Right. Oh, before her year of the 9 ceremony. But so essentially Jonas would be turning 13 years old. But like we said, after the year of 12s, they don't keep track of their age so much anymore.
He doesn't even know his birthday, really. It's just in that year. But anyways.
So essentially he would be like almost 13 years old. He's gone through like the year of training with the giver. And so the giver continues to give him these memories, like we've said. The sled, and the first painful one he gets is of a sunburn. And then later he gets more intense things like a war, and he feels a broken leg snapped in half from like a sledding incident.
When he hurts himself on the sled. That was his first incident.
So the giver gives him like another version of the sled memory, and it's like somebody who like flew off the sled and like broke his leg, and then he throws up from the pain, and then he has blood and vomit on his face,
and he feels it after he comes out of the memory.
So once he comes out of the memory, he kind of still feels the pain in his leg, and he limps home. And like we said, he's not allowed to ask for medication that goes with the things that he feels in training. So he kind of just has to feel this emotion.
I also, a good thing to point out is the whole time he's questioning why this is kept secret. Like, I think even when he has the sledding moment, he's like, people should know about this. Or like, why can't people see red? That's so weird.
Every single time, because like we said, one of the rules now is that Jonas doesn't have to like adhere to like the rudeness, or like he can kind of ask any questions he wants, which is something that nobody is allowed to do. And so the giver kind of encourages him to ask questions like, do you have any questions about this? Or should we start with questions you have? And so Jonas will a lot of times kind of just go out in like an outburst of like, why aren't we allowed to see the colors? Like, I don't get why they made this decision, and that's kind of stupid. Why don't we do this anymore?
He would have him go through it. Like, Jonas would be like, well, pragmatically, I get it.
Right.
Because then you'd have the freedom of choice, and people would always choose wrong. But then he'd go, so that makes sense. And then he'd wait for a second and go, but it's really nice, and it's beautiful. I'm trying to think of, I don't think it was with the color red he did that. Maybe that was with love.
I was about to say. So when he actually says that is something that I was going to discuss later also,
okay,
but
we'll discuss that one later.
I can just kind of say he says that right after he asks about like, wow, what if people were able to choose their own spouses? What if they chose wrong? And I was like, oh, Jonas, if you could only see today's day and age in 2020.
I thought the same thing. I was like, the divorce rate.
Right. So he kind of has all those realizations of like what choice means and why like the elders in the communities of
why
like many years before.
And you mentioned that earlier, the idea of thinking between logic and emotion. And the elders definitely chose logic.
Right.
Probably because of some traumatic things that have been happening. But I mean, even the original ones, they probably were like, well, we've seen what emotion has done, so let's just like get rid of it.
Yeah, exactly.
But what they forget is like how important it is. But that's kind of one of the themes we'll talk about.
Yeah.
So Jonas is always questioning why.
He has all those like realizations of like the awfulness of all the choices that have happened. Yeah. And like how they've gotten to this point. And
he knows actually it's not tries from like a mean-spirited point,
so he understands why these choices were essentially made and why people are doing what they do, but he kind of does a few little tests here and there with his own friends. He kind of is up to Asher and he's like, oh, look at these flowers really hard. Like, do you see anything weird about them? Because they're like bright yellow flowers. And he's trying to get Asher to see color. And so he's kind of grabbing onto Asher's shoulders. And Asher, after a few seconds, kind of uncomfortably like shifts away from him because they mention like it's very inappropriate for anyone like outside of the family unit to touch one another. And so he's like, oh no, like what's wrong with you? And he's like, oh, I just, maybe thought like they needed more watering. We should tell the garden people they need more watering. But, really he was trying to get him to see color. There. Yes, which he is allowed to lie.
But he said he never would.
He never would, but...
So, also, before we get to what happens at the end of that year, let's circle back to Gabe and talk about Gabe for a second. For some reason, a big thing just we'll say real quick, Jonas's eyes are a different color than everyone else's.
They describe it as a pale color.
Yeah, it's very pale. I'm wondering if it's like, I assumed gray, but I guess everything's grayish.
Right.
I don't know if it was like...
I don't know if you remember, but that Fairly Odd Parents episode when everything is gray and they are blobs. And then there's still a way that they're like, I'm grayer and blobbier than you. And then they bully the other kids. But anyways, it made me think of that. I like
vague reference to that. Maybe they're blue in real life. I don't know. I feel like it wasn't
blue. I would think... So essentially when they said that, I would assume blue once he starts seeing colors, but he also never describes it as blue, even when he's able to get
like
color.
Like gray, because they were super different.
He just describes them as pale.
Yeah.
So like, how if you see something in grayscale and that was black and white,
very unnatural.
There's something that's still like paler or darker than other things. So like their eye color was pale.
Yeah. And something he noticed when he was selected was that the giver had the pale eyes. He also noticed only one other kid, a 6-year-old, a year 6, had pale eyes, and she stood out. And I think they even both kind of looked at each other like confused. And so Gabe, we find out, also has the pale eyes. Same time. So he at first kind of tries to ignore Gabe. When they bring him in, he sits at his desk, he stays away. But I almost feel like it's because he's trying to not, because I think he can feel like, I'm going to feel some connection.
Right.
Because then he starts, one night, I can't remember why he does he decide to take Gabe in to test on him? Or
no, so what happens is that one night, his parents are complaining about Gabe and how they never get any sleep because of Gabe. And I want to say it was because there was something that he had done in the day earlier with the giver that he was like, I'm not going to be able to sleep, so I should like have the child with me. Yeah. But anyways, essentially what happens is that Jonas suggests having Gabe in his bedroom instead of his parents' bedroom so that, the parents could get a break and some sleep. And so they agree, and Jonas brings Gabe into his room, and he's kind of like, waiting, he's sleeping, and then once Gabe wakes up, he kind of also wakes up to the baby crying, and then he holds Gabe and he realizes that he has transferred a memory through patting his back. He pictures like a beautiful blue serene sailboat scene that the giver has given him.
Not purposely, just like aimlessly
he's just thinking about it. Yeah, so the giver gave it to him and now accidentally has given it to Gabe.
Gabe suddenly calms
he realized,
down.
Gabe has suddenly like become quiet. He's not crying anymore, and he's like, wow, I have like the wisp of the memory.
Yeah, and he loses part of it for sure.
So he realizes suddenly, like, oh my gosh, I just gave him the memory. So he puts him down quickly, and then like waits until later when Gabe kind of stirs again. And then really the way they describe it is that like he very, I don't know, like he chooses specifically to give him that memory, rather than that being an accident and something that he does by choice.
Doesn't he give him the rest of that memory? Because he only gave him inklings of the memory.
Yeah, so he gives him the rest of the memory, and then Gabe sleeps through the rest of the night. So
they kind of form a bond.
Right.
Then, should we jump to kind of the climax? Because the rest is just training and Gabe, Jonas questioning.
Right.
Then, we find out Gabe is going to be released, which to Jonas was disappointing, but not the end of the world.
Right.
He tells the giver that, and the giver is noticeably not happy.
A little distraught.
About the idea of release. And so he decides, let's show Jonas what a release is.
Right. And so what had happened is that in the nurturing center, his father had mentioned that one of the birth mothers was pregnant with male twins. That's right. And so they were hoping that they were not identical twins, because if they are identical twins, then the one with the lower weight will be released, and then the one, you know, that does not have, like, that is higher weight will be continued into the society. And so they do find out they're identical, and Jonas mentions, like, oh, my father would have already done the release, and he told me about the release, and it just means, like, they send them elsewhere. Jonas assumes someone comes and picks him up and takes them. Right.
Lily even was saying, like, oh, maybe he's in another community, and secretly we all have twins in another community, which would have been in itself a very interesting Lily. And they kind of joke Lily could be a storyteller, but I digress.
So essentially, he is mentioning to the giver, like, oh yeah, he told me, like, my father told me that, you know, that one gets set up all comfortably. He sends him to elsewhere, and the release happens, and that's it. And he said, you know, I'd actually kind of like to watch a release, but, you know, I bet that the one this morning already happened, so we'll watch it next time. And then the giver kind of, you know, sits there for a moment, and he says, you know, I think you should see, like, a release. Now that you are the receiver of memory, you can do whatever you want. You can ask anybody anything, and they have to show you
what a release is.
And so he is like, you should see the release. And Jonas is like, oh, well, it was supposed to be this morning, so I bet it already happened. And so the giver goes up to the little speaker, like we said, which the giver actually kind of has the ability to turn it off. And not like in 1984, it's not a lie to catch people. He is not the thought police. He is actually able to turn it off, and it is for real. He has this ability and nobody else does. So he flips the speaker back on, and they ask, yes, like, what can we help you with? And so he tells, like, the attendant, we would like to see the release from this morning. And immediately, immediately the attendant is like, yes, right away, we'll show you it. And it plays up on the screen, and Jonas sees his father, and he sees the twins, and then they're weighing them, and then
one is like an ounce or two less.
Yeah. They are barely different in weight. I think one of them was 6 pounds exactly. Even. And then the other one was like 5 pounds and 10 ounces or something like that. And it was very close. And so then Jonas's father and the nurse are standing there like, oh, wow, we would have thought that they were almost exactly identical. That would have been crazy. We wouldn't know what to do. And so then he sends the nurse or the assistant.
It's his trainee.
Yeah. And I'm calling her nurse.
The father, like, is training a new nurturer.
So he sends her away with the 6-pound child, and he takes the one that is slightly smaller. And then Jonas is like, oh, so this is when, you know, he makes them all cozy. Yeah, that word choice I thought was really interesting, too. Yeah,
gets all wrapped up and bundled.
He's like, oh, this must be when he gets them cozy for elsewhere.
And the giver's not, usually the giver's pretty, like, calm with him, and he's like, Jonas, stop talking.
He's like, shut up, Jonas. Just watch the screen.
I know, he's like, please.
And so then Jonas is like, oh, okay, like, I guess I shouldn't say anything. And Jonas kind of just keeps having, like, the stream of thoughts, like, that stream of consciousness. And saying, like, oh, this must be when he gets him all cozy, because, you know, he takes the child to the other, like, like, I don't know, table area to set them up.
And it's just a regular room, too. He expected it to be, like, a special room, because releases happen in special.
So he takes the child, and then he notices that he's getting, like, a little vial ready and a syringe. Yeah. And then Jonas is like, oh, so after this is much...
He thought that was the normal shots babies take. So
right. He was like, oh, I forgot that, like, you know, the new children have to take shots. Like, I'm cringing at the thought.
But then...
And so he sets it up. And then the father puts, like, the syringe in the baby's forehead.
Yeah, which is like, unsettling to read.
Very unsettling. And so the father is using, like, the sing-songy voice that he uses with, also like, Gabe and all the other new children. And Jonas is like, oh, that's very familiar to me. Like, I heard him.
But I think Jonas started to get uncomfortable the second the forehead shot happened.
Because then, you know, the child starts to cry. And then he kind of says in the sing-songy voice, oh, like, I know, like, it hurts, but, like, we can't use any of the veins in your arms. Like, you're too small.
Yeah.
So it has to go in your head. And it was a really creepy kind of sentence in itself.
It was.
But, so then after a second, Jonas describes the new child's arms and legs kind of spasming towards, like, the ceiling.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they are still.
Yep.
And he draws a comparison from that to the memory of the soldier on the field that was asking for water, that had his eyes, like, kind of roll back, and he noticed that, like, the life had gone from the body. So he knows that the child is now dead. And he has, like, all the emotions that he never knew were actually emotions wash over him from all the memories he has, like, held up. And
the baby's just thrown away.
Right. So the mother kind of just puts him in a little box.
And then throws
the way that I pictured it in my head to kind of match, like, the crass setting was that, like, it was a shoebox, and then he just got thrown down like a trash chute, which essentially is what they say. Is that I think he says a carton is the word that he uses.
It's pretty much the same thing they throw away their food in.
Yeah. So he puts them in a little carton, and then he's like, he threw it down something that looked like a trash chute. A trash chute? Did I just say that?
A trash shooting.
A trash chute. And so then Jonas, after seeing that, the screen goes dark. He breaks out into tears. He's screaming. He doesn't understand. He's saying, like, you know, my father killed the child. I don't understand.
And this is what we were talking about earlier with the first person point of view being countered with other people's words, because Jonas immediately was like, my dad's a murderer. He's been lying to me. He's evil. And the giver says he doesn't understand murder. He doesn't know this is murder. He thinks this is normal. He doesn't realize the severity of what he just did.
Right. Because he doesn't think it's evil.
The emotions have been taken out of him. He hasn't been taught what it is.
Right.
It's routine.
To him, it's just release. It's not murder.
Yeah, and that's the thing you realize is, oh my god, that's every time you hear the word release.
Right.
There's no elsewhere. At least, I mean, there is, but, like, when they say people are released to elsewhere, they're not.
That essentially means the afterlife, but they don't really know that.
And he even freaks out to the point where he stopped taking his medication, by the way, so he does start feeling stirrings for Fiona again.
Yeah.
And he was like, Fiona would never do that. And the giver says she's actually already being trained and is very good at...
Since she is somebody who's a caretaker of the House of the Old. Yeah. And
the giver says, no, she's actually pretty good at giving releases to the elderly or the old. So... Yeah, that's when Jonas, I think, kind of snaps a little bit.
Yeah,
not
and
outwardly,
so
but...
I would say this is when, so the giver kind of calls in his little speaker that he can ask for anything. He says, let Jonas's family unit know that he will be staying with me overnight.
Which is like
normal because he's saying it's for training, you know, and then the family
his training is so important the family wouldn't question it. And
it's very honorable, which they mention a lot of times. And he mentions that this is like a position with the most honor, and from it you gain wisdom, and with all the memories you gain wisdom, and that makes you honorable, but it does not make you powerful. And those are two different things, and that the elders will sometimes call on your wisdom, but they will never think that you are powerful. And so Jonas kind of stays there overnight, and he kind of is asking the giver all these questions about all these emotions that he's feeling. And so I believe this is when the giver kind of goes into descriptions about Rosemary.
So I think he's already
mentioned
he's already explained what happened to her.
Okay, yeah.
He explained she couldn't handle it and asked for release.
Right.
And this is when he
realizes that release means death.
And she did it to herself. Like, she asked to inject herself. She injected herself, and they had him watch it, and he looked away.
But, okay, so back up a little. Can you describe who Rosemary is?
Yes, we never talk about Rosemary. So, Rosemary, 10 years before Jonas, was the person selected to be the receiver. She was in training.
And describe her eyes.
gray, also correct, I would assume.
Pale eyes.
Pale eyes. She was in training only for 5 weeks, I want to say.
Yes, it was 5 weeks.
I think they jumped in a little too soon with her. I think the giver felt like he showed her too much pain too quick. He didn't show her war pain, which I thought was interesting. He showed her loss and loneliness. And he tried to give her happy memories, but she couldn't get over it. And one day, he showed her the loss of a child, or starvation. I think it was the loss of a child, though.
He had shown her both. Like,
I can't remember which one made her, like,
yeah, which was
snap.
the last straw. Yeah.
But she left and apparently asked for her release. And and he'd already told Jonas that much. But in that moment, he said to Jonas, yeah, I had to look away because they were showing me inject herself.
Right.
So that was the other...
Jonas understands what release is at that point, that it is essentially death. And that when Rosemary asked for release, that means that she was asking to die. And when the giver explains it to him, he says Rosemary, after that last session, looked at the giver, gave him a hug, kissed him on the cheek, and then he never saw her again. And then, next time he saw her was the release, and that she was asking for the release. And instead of them injecting her, as Jonas's father did the new child, she elected to inject herself, which means so she put their syringe in herself, and that she died after that, and the giver couldn't watch as she did that.
And an interesting thing and this is where Jonas already knew this when he first described Rosemary. When Rosemary died, all of those memories that she had, the loss and the loneliness, went out to the community. Because if someone's not holding them,
right,
people have to gain it.
Right,
so
they feel them. In
that night, Jonas and the giver hatch a plan. Well, the giver already had been kind of thinking of it, but he didn't know how to do it until Jonas made a comment of, well, what if I just drowned in the river? All of my memories would go to the people. And the giver thought, oh crap, we could totally fake that.
Yeah. So
in that night, they solidify their plan to have Jonas run away, as he already has a year of memories under him, which is a lot. And when the further away he gets from the community, when he goes into the elsewhere, because they do call the area around the community the elsewhere.
The elsewhere, yeah.
The community will get his memories, and the giver decides to stay to help out the people because they
will seek his wisdom, because it is something they've never encountered before.
Just like Jonas.
So, like, as we said, even if something catastrophic like that happens to the community, and suddenly they're all feeling the emotions of what war was like, what differences were like, what colors might be like, and how different they look from each other, and that sameness now gone.
Yeah.
That instead of it being, I don't know, like absolute chaos, the way that he's describing it is that even if something like that were to happen, they would still seek his wisdom, because it is something that's never happened
He's
before.
there for the chaos.
So he's there if something that has never happened.
And again, the community isn't malicious, so there wouldn't be like elders going, oh no, like let's hide this. They wouldn't even know what's going on, because the elders have openly said, we don't really know what wisdom the giver has.
Yep.
So it would be good. So they come up with that plan. However,
there's a little bump in the road,
because the father announces that Gabe will be released the following morning. Not that night, but like at a dinner one night before they went through with the plan. He says, yeah, in the morning we're going to release Gabriel.
And this is because it's about to be the ceremonies again. And so it's exactly a year. So they all had unanimously voted like Gabe needs to be released rather than being assigned a family, because
even the father,
he will not sleep through the night.
Yeah. Which is so crazy to think, like, what babies sleep through the night? Like, they must have, like, really...
At, like, 1 year old.
So basically, Jonas steals Gabe in the night, takes his dad's bike, and he makes his escape.
Right, and he takes his father's bike because it has a little seat.
Yeah, it has the little, like, when you see babies on bikes, like, that the dad's bike has that attached. He was going to take his own bike. No, the giver was going to be a part of the plan, right? Because of the change, he couldn't be, and Jonas just hoped, like, he might know what to do, like, and he would, like, it doesn't really change what the giver has to do.
Yeah, and the giver wanted to give Jonas all of his memories of courage and strength, because he knew that Jonas would need them in his escape.
Because he would have to be traveling very far, and he does travel very far.
Yeah.
They go looking for Jonas, planes fly over. But Jonas, I thought this was really smart and kind of shows you how the like feelings do go outward. Since the planes can't see colors, they sense through heat.
Yep.
And in order to hide themselves, Jonas projects cold good memories onto him and Gabe so that they can't be picked up on the heat because they do become cold. So I thought that was very interesting. Right. He does that when then they get to colder climates. He starts projecting the sun. But the issue is, as Jonas projects those onto Gabe, he loses it. Yeah. So he starts to get very weak.
The same way that the Giver loses his memories and he only has wisps.
The Giver even loses that sense of color, too.
Right. Like, right before Jonas leaves, he mentions that he can no longer see color and that he's given them all to Jonas. Mm-hmm. And so Jonas kind of gives some of these to Gabe as they are trying to, like,
keep
survive. So that way, you know, he can keep them alive. He makes them cold when the planes are looking for heat. And then when they... after a while, they're biking, and the planes stop coming. And once the planes stop coming, they actually hit snow. Mm-hmm. And so he knows that this is beyond any of the communities. So, like, you know, there's their community, control. And there's actually a few other communities outside of theirs that are, like, slightly different, but they have the same idea. They kind of mention that, like, the only difference are, like, the dwellings and different things.
They only have one, receiver of memory because the receiver travels to all the other communities to help them as well.
So, like, he has to travel very far. So he goes past all those additional communities and he goes past, and once the planes stop coming, he feels a little bit more safe and he starts riding during the daytime, which he had not been doing before. So essentially he's out in the middle of nowhere and he starts to see, like, wilderness and animals, which is something that doesn't exist in their world, in their community.
I thought that was really interesting too, when they go, oh, this mythical creature, the elephant. And it was like, what?
And so he actually gets a memory of an elephant from the Giver, and it's actually a very painful memory. Yes. Because it's a memory of, like, an elephant being poached for its tusks and another elephant coming to mourn the elephant who has now been murdered.
Very sad moment.
So that's something that Jonas gets. And so Lily's comfort animal, which is essentially like a stuffed animal toy that the younger children have, is an elephant. And he kind of mentions, like, oh, did you know there was real elephants? And she's like, yeah, right, Jonas, that never happened.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's one of those other instances that we see that none of them are able, like, they don't have the capacity to feel. Mm-hmm. And they're not able to even understand what that would be like. So essentially Jonas goes further. He reaches some woods. He actually sees some birds for the first time. He sees, like, fish out in the wild and not just for food. Yeah. He catches fish. He's able to do it with, like, Gabriel's blanket as, like, a makeshift net. So they're running out of food. They kind of had some provisions that the Giver had been kind of saving away.
And they were stealing because they were passing the agricultural farms. So I think
so during all, like, the agriculture stuff, he had been taking potatoes, and carrots, I think, was the other food.
But they were really running on nothing near the end of the book.
So at the end, uphill. He was kind of saying he knew the feeling of starvation because the Giver had given it to him, and he now realized that that is what he was feeling.
Well, not even just that, but remember in the beginning, he mentions one of his flaws as a kid was he said, oh, I'm starving, and he got reprimanded.
Yeah, he says that at the very end of the book when he's describing.
Well, he mentions the story in the beginning, though, and then it's another circle moment.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just excited.
Asher also did the thing with the smack and the smack.
But that was Jonas's, is he used the word starving. He meant hungry, and he was like, oh, this is definitely starving.
Yeah. And he recalls that memory of when he was younger and used the wrong words. And he said, like, no, like, this is what it means to be starving. I am starving because I know, like, I've had that memory that the Giver has given me of people actually being starving. And so he tries to give all the memories of, like, being full and happy to Gabe, because obviously the baby is now, like, crying because he doesn't have any food.
Starving,
He's freezing to death, essentially, because they're still in the snow. They only have, like, his tunic around the two of them, and then Gabe is, like, wrapped in his little blankets that's kind of all destroyed from being used as, like, a fishing net.
And also stuff. He's been biking for God knows how many days, so his legs, like can't move anymore.
Days, and the bike can't go through the snow, so essentially when they first get to the snow, they, you know, abandon the bike.
When he goes uphill, really, the bike can't move anymore, so he starts having to walk uphill in the snow. Shout out to all the parents who use that story.
What story?
You've never heard that?
I don't know what
oh my god, there's like adults who will be like, when I was a kid, I had to walk uphill in the snow to get to school. You have it easy. It's like it's like not a meme, but like it's a...
Oh, I don't know that.
Oh my gosh, you'll have to look that up after this. That's like a thing. Like adults will be like, oh, I used to have to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I know my parents had to, like, walk to school, but they never were like...
They would make jokes. They would make jokes. Like my dad would make that joke. Anyways.
Okay, but anyways, so they're walking uphill in the snow. And essentially, you know, he's trying to give all these memories to Gabe so they can get out of the situation.
He's really depleted.
And yeah, so kind of he gives the last memory he has of sunshine and warmth to Gabe. And he kind of has a little bit of it for himself. And he's like, wow, the sunshine really like reinvigorated me. I'm able to keep going. And then essentially he walks like 5 more steps and then collapses into the snow because the memory is fleeting and gone. And they're kind of just like there in the snow at the top of the hill. And then that's when he sees a red sled there on the top of the hill with the little rope to steer that he kind of mentions.
The same sled, I think.
So he gets on the sled with Gabe and he takes special precaution to make sure that Gabe is all safe next to him. And they go down the hill. And as he's going towards the hill, or going down the hill, he sees a village or a little house with lights all lit up. And the tree inside with lights, and he hears music for the first time,
which some of this we didn't discuss, so we will.
Yeah, so we'll go into it in a second. And yeah, so he hears music for the first time. He's going towards the houses, and he says like maybe it's only an echo, and then that's kind of how the novel ends.
It's not even just that too, though, because he says I also hear it behind me, but maybe that's an echo. So kind of a point of, oh, I think my community's becoming whole. And that's what.
Can you hand me your book?
Oh,
I want to read the very last sentence because it's
I thought there was something on me and I was like, what is it? It's a very good last line. One of those that sticks with you as neither of us can remember it.
So the closing 2 lines are, behind him across vast distances of space and time from the place he had left, he thought he heard music too, but perhaps it was only an echo. So that's how the book ends.
Yes. So that's the plot. Right. We really like this book. As you can see, we went really into it. But a few things I want to mention. The music was very important because that's actually what the giver heard first. The giver...
How we kind of discussed that Jonas saw the change first. The giver kind of describes
hearing
that
music.
He heard beyond instead of seeing beyond like Jonas did.
Yes. And it was music. So for Jonas, that was a big deal to hear the music.
Because the giver tells him, like, I'll give you the music before I go. But selfishly, I've been keeping it for myself.
I know. I think he actually says, or were you going to say this next? He says, keep it.
Well, Jonas, like, he tells Jonas, before you leave, I will give it to you. And Jonas says, no, you need to keep it.
Yeah. So finally, Jonas hears it. So before we go into all of that, because mine we'll go into a little bit, what's your most, like, what part stuck out to you the most that you liked?
So I would say that my favorite part is specifically when they asked, when Jonas asked about like, what would happen if you pick the wrong mate? Because I don't know, that point specifically, he asks that and then he kind of laughs to himself like, oh, it makes sense why they choose for everybody because what if you made the wrong choice? And I don't know, I felt like that's very topical being somebody in your young 20s that we can kind of relate to or like see like in the world around us with friends and family and people who are getting married or even divorced already like in a few years. So I don't know, I think that's very like interesting, and that was a part that just really stuck out to me because we haven't really discussed this yet, and I know we will in a second here, but like the idea of love that Jonas is introduced to.
You can probably see what my next thing is.
I just thought that was super interesting, and Jonas, like, when he finally sees that first instance of love, that's when he asks about, like, well, what if people used that and then they chose the wrong mate? And it's like, okay, but they have the choice to choose, which is something that Jonas says, like, right after that. And he's like, you know, like, I think I would like the option to choose. And he doesn't really explain more because, like we said, he's 12 years old, but... I don't know, it's just very interesting that he's like, I'd rather have the choice to choose wrong than have no choice at all.
So you want to hear my favorite part?
Yeah.
My favorite part was kind of that part. Not what you just mentioned, but what you literally just said. And it might be corny to pick this part, but I really liked when Jonas received the memory, and we didn't mention this memory yet. I think it was the giver's favorite memory.
It was. He mentioned it was his favorite.
It was a family, not a family unit, but a family with grandparents and everything.
Right.
I think it's snowing outside again. A lot of
It is.
snow. Lois Lowry must have. I mean, she was in Maine, so she knows the cold. But they were nice inside, warm, bundled up. There was a tree in the corner with lights
in a fireplace.
Yes,
all lit up.
a fireplace. So you assume it was Christmas.
Right.
And there was just warmth and happiness, but like deep. Jonas could feel it was deeper than that. And I remember reading this, and I was like, "Is it gonna be love?" Or is it religion? I don't know why my mind was like, I don't want it to be religion because the book hasn't felt religious, so it kind of would feel off base.
Right.
But then Jonas, after the memory, goes to the giver and says, well, what was that? And the giver says, that was love. Mm-hmm. And it was, I don't know, it was just like a very beautiful moment, because I feel like for me, I'm always like, well, what can define love? And I loved that love wasn't defined as some grand thing. It was just peace and comfort and like warmth. I like that it was that instead of just some like huge gesture. It was just comfort. And that kind of goes back. That's why that ending scene was such a big deal, because the cabin he gets to was basically that memory. Is he gets to a warm home with a tree on the inside and people singing.
Yeah. It's essentially the same memory,
but like in real life.
In real life.
Also, a same thing with that. When he first got the sledding memory, when he stopped, he realized there was something beyond what when he stopped, he was like, I feel like I need to keep going. And so in the end, that's when you see what you keep going. But I digressed from my favorite moment. My favorite moment was when he learns what love is.
His favorite memory.
Yeah. And it's love. And it just felt like a really sweet way to explain love, in my opinion. I don't know if it's because I'm family oriented as a person, but I don't know. It just felt like.
I mean, no, I agree. And also being a pretty family oriented person, when he's describing like the feeling of like, why is there grandparents there?
Yeah.
Because they don't usually have. He's like, oh, why are they not in the house of the old? And then he kind of says like, oh, well, it's the parents' and they actually know them. And then Jonas has that moment of feeling sad, like if he ever applied for children, then his parents would already be in the house of the old and he never sees them again.
And he,
like, there's no connection there.
It's another situation where he understands the logic. Like, logically, it is harder to have to take care of them on your own. But at the same time, he's like, but I would enjoy grandparents. Yeah. So he's starting to understand that, like, yes, and this is the point we're going to get to, is that, like, yes, things can be challenging.
Right.
But with that challenge comes amazing things.
Yeah.
With grandparents and being a struggle comes the love grandparents can give you.
Yep.
Grandparents are watching this probably.
Shout out to all our grandparents.
I know they do, because my dad asks for the link to this afterwards to send. And my grandpa liked that I called out his name in the first one, so shout out to Hal again. I keep just pointing to the screen. Subscribe.
Yeah, Grandpa. So, okay, we've kind of subscribe, Grandpa, to all you grandpas out there. Subscribe to our channel and the podcast on Apple Podcasts.
We'll give you a shout out.
So, anything else that were like themes or symbolism that we haven't discussed while discussing the plot that you want to go into?
I have a lot, but I'll try to like condense.
Okay, give me one and then maybe I'll go next.
This one's quick, maybe. I don't know. This might be more of a question.
Right. That'd be fun.
Lois Lowry mentioned in the beginning that we talked about that parents, and I might have mentioned this earlier, parents wrote to her saying, oh, I named my child Gabriel.
Yeah.
And after reading the book, I was like, I would really pick Jonas. But, so I don't know if you think why. I have a few reasons. If it's biblical, people tend to lean towards biblical names.
People do that.
Jonas could be representing... Or not Jonas. Gabriel could be representing the angel Gabriel, because maybe he sees like the innocence in an angel.
Right.
So I don't know if people picked up on that, but
I guess maybe because, no, this is just me throwing a wild shot in the dark, but I don't know. The fact that Jonas has done things or chosen things, like you can attribute different, I don't know, characteristics onto him, whereas Gabriel is like, he is only innocent because he's a new child or basically like a 1-year-old little kid.
It's worth saving and risking your life for.
And there's even a moment in the very end where Jonas says he wasn't afraid for himself, but he was only worried that he wouldn't be able to save Gabriel. And I think that is kind of going out to, like, obviously Jonas has learned love and he understands what that is, as though like he almost regards Gabriel as like a family member and that he is like a brother to him.
100% his little brother.
And so, you know,
almost
obviously
like his own child, honestly.
You would think that, like, being somebody in a family, if you have a happy family life, then you would be like, yeah, I would sacrifice myself for a family member, or I could see something like that if it was that extreme. But there's like nothing that he has ever known that's like that, so that line is pretty significant. So I would say just because Gabriel is something
so important to Jonas.
Yeah, somebody who's so important to like the protagonist, and he is like completely innocent. Like we said, he's a blank slate. Jonas, obviously, in my eyes, is a very heroic protagonist, but you know, maybe other people disagree, or there's like, because Jonas has now been able to make choices, people can argue that they might be the wrong choices. So maybe people are more inclined to name people after Gabriel, who has done nothing wrong in his 1 year of life, rather than Jonas.
Good. Yeah. So another question, and I think this is the big question. Do you consider the end death?
Okay. So I know we've discussed, we'll kind of touch back on Lois Lowry as an author and as a person, but I know that we have both
reminding me of quotes from her.
So that we have both done our research on her, and originally she intended the ending of The Giver to be open-ended. So you're
decide.
Yeah, you pretty much get to decide if that is real, or if maybe that's a memory, or if it's something that Jonas has experienced and something that's different than a memory. But it was meant to be a standalone book. Now there is a quartet of novels,
which I might ignore.
Which
I'm sorry.
I kind of want to read, because I did see that they were very like well beloved and stuff. Even people who
I'll explain why I want to ignore them. It's not because they're bad.
But essentially, I don't want to spoil anything, but spoiler alert if you haven't read any of these books. Essentially, in I believe it's 2 of the novels, they imply that Jonas is still alive.
Well, he's an actual character in them.
Yeah, but not like a main character or anything. But he's just like a person. Roles. Yeah.
He's the leader.
So, yeah. So he's a person in these novels, which implies that he has survived this ordeal. And I don't know if they actually go into any details or anything about why he survived or anything.
But before knowing that, what was your interpretation?
Right. I'm getting there.
I'm sorry.
No, you're okay. But so before that, she had intended like this novel to be standalone. It was never supposed to be part of a series. And so she always was saying that she enjoyed seeing what people thought about the ending, and that she did intend it for it to be open-ended. I think as a kid, as a 12-year-old, I guess maybe I didn't understand the significance of things being open-ended, or, you know, you choose what happens in the end. And I guess when I was younger, I did kind of want it to be true, because, you know, I'm 12. Not a lot of bad things have happened to me in life yet. I don't know. I guess I always just thought like it was beautiful, the ending, when I was younger. And now, I mean, yeah, it can be. Now, I kind of picture it as, obviously, if I'm thinking it like standalone, to me, it seems like, obviously, we kind of discussed that like the memories are kind of fading from Jonas. But I think maybe instead of recalling a memory, he's able to actually form his own memories, which is something kind of interesting we might discuss. But I think it's kind of just him seeing his happiest moment, which is like a memory that he's never even been able to have. And that moment is like what he sees and actually what he hears before, I don't know, like perishing.
Yeah.
But I don't know, like I did think that the ending would be like he doesn't make it, because it seems too coincidental that he's like, it's my red sled and I know exactly what to do, and it has my rope that I used to steer. And I don't know, the ending is very beautiful when he says that he's able to hear music for the first time. And we know that the giver hasn't given him this memory, so that's also something that you could use to argue like it is real, because how would he know what music is if it's not actually there?
There might be music in that afterlife.
Exactly, so I don't know. So I would say that I lean more towards the like he probably died along with Gabe, which is pretty sad, but I don't know, I feel like there is a lot of content, especially with just the music part, that you could argue that like he actually did survive.
Yeah. So for me, my immediate assumption was he's dead. Like, just like from reading it, after thinking, I don't know why, I don't know if it's because it was my initial thought, I still like to not that I want Jonas to be dead, but I do consider Jonas to be dead, and that's partly why I said I don't want to read the other 3. Like, I will, because they're good. But I was like, oh, when I read that, because
I've heard that the other ones are even more sad, so I was like, if the ending is for the giver is supposed to be that Jonas maybe dies and Jonas is alive, but those books are sadder, maybe we should look into those.
But I don't know, I just felt like, and I'm looking at purely surface level right now. He passes out, and then suddenly, oh, here's his red sled. And my mind was just like, if this memory of the sled was like a century old, how is there still a sled here? How is there still this cabin here? So for me, it just felt like too close to the memory to be reality. And maybe it's not reality. Maybe he passed out and he did survive, and that was just him passing out. You know, that could be how Lois Lowry got over it. But it felt too surreal. This is one of the things I held back on saying because it was more interesting to talk about now. Kids wrote to her saying what they thought the ending meant, and I thought their endings were so cool, and I was very jealous of these like 6th graders. The best one, which I didn't say to you, this 6th grader said, well, what I think happened is Jonas was going in a circle and didn't realize, and he actually reached his community after rehabilitating from getting the memories.
Oh my gosh, that's really cool.
So I was like, you smart little girl. Another boy said Jonas is like Jesus because he took all the pain away. So he's like, it's a representation of Jesus, and then there's Christmas to back it up.
Right.
He took the pain so the community wouldn't suffer, even though it's kind of the opposite. He actually gave them suffering.
Right, if you think about it.
But he kind of did that to give them happiness. So I don't know. But it's
well,
like
I guess it is kind of like Jesus because he takes the suffering and then he dies, and then the people have the suffering because of his death, and then he comes back to life. So I guess if you go with the rest of the novels and he's alive, then that would kind of go with the Jesus theme.
It really would. And then a 7th grade boy just goes, I was surprised he died. So it's just funny how, like, she thought it was so funny how people just go, that's strong assumptions. But I want you to make those strong assumptions.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was just very interesting. That was most of it for the death, or not death. Like I said, I think for some reason in my mind I want it to be death, but I understand it could not be. I know we're getting a little tight on time, but I did want to talk about one of the themes. It's like the main theme of the book is basically like, I want to put it in my own words, but I know she'll say it better, but it's basically like you can't ignore the bad because then you don't have the good.
Right.
And she actually said that. She gave a speech for the Lois Lowry gave a speech for the Newberry award, and I put it here as a quote because I thought it was really good. We cannot live in a walled world, in an only us, only now world, where we are all the same and feel safe. We would have to sacrifice too much. The richness of color and diversity would disappear. The feelings of other humans would no longer be necessary. Choice would be obsolete. So it's just like, that's how she feels with the giver, and that's kind of what I got from it, was just that, like, all that pain is horrible, but if you get rid of pain, you get rid of happiness. And I know that's kind of a philosophical question because some people could argue the opposite. But a lot of people do feel like, how would you know true happiness if you've never felt true pain? Like, Jonas probably will know extreme happiness after he eats the food after starvation, but would he have known the happiness before?
Right.
You know?
And I was going to say that went into something I wanted to discuss, which was like love and choices, and why is it important to make the wrong choices? Because that's something, like I said, which was like the part when Jonas was discussing, like, what if you choose wrong? Like, what will happen? And I guess, like, obviously if you don't have consequences, like you said, then you never learn. And so without consequences, I would also argue that you don't know happiness, because you never know what the opposite of that was, which was like something that was bad or incorrect. And, you know, obviously that differs per person. And like she said in that quote, like, without the diversity and like other choice that people have, it gets rid of essential feelings, which is like love and pain. And like you said, that's like kind of a philosophical thing, but love and pain are kind of on that same spectrum of feeling. And like, if you have the absence of love, then you definitely have pain. So.
I don't want to quote South Park because I don't actually watch South Park. Not that I'm judging anyone who does, but I don't watch South Park. But I saw on Instagram a clip from it randomly this week, like, how serendipitous. And it was one of the characters, pretty sure Butters.
Right, I know who Butters is.
Yes. He is crying after a breakup, and it like explained the book so perfectly, weirdly. he was crying after a breakup, and there's like emo kids,
right?
And they're like, see, this is why you shouldn't love you. This is why you should just be numb. And he's like, well, no, I disagree. Because even though I'm sad, there's a reason I'm sad. And that's because I felt true happiness and true love.
Right.
So in order to not feel this sadness, I would have never had to feel that love. And I don't want to give up that love for anything. And I was like, he said it so nice, like perfect.
So eloquently.
As a little 5th grader in South Park as a felt cartoon. But that's basically it. Which goes into our other topics of like, you can technically learn all these themes in current day things. So why do we have to read centuries old books?
Right.
Not about the Giver.
But maybe about other 2 books we've read so far.
Frankenstein's good. It's just hard.
It is, but
Frankenstein should be your choice.
Exactly. I will say, I did have a professor who said, I don't understand why we keep assigning these books that are so old when we have more contemporary books that match today's kind of genres and how we feel as a society now.
I do have a counter to that in a second.
Why do we read Lord of the Flies when the Hunger Games exists now?
So a counter to that, actually something that Lois Lowry said, someone asked, and this isn't what you're saying, but somebody asked her, why are there so many Holocaust books? There's Holocaust book after Holocaust book. We know what the Holocaust is.
Right.
And her daughter-in-law is actually German and I think had connections in her family to the Holocaust.
Right.
As like a victim, not as a Nazi.
Right.
And,
so like Jewish ancestry. Yeah.
And she pointed out, because we can't forget those things. It's so important to, and I think that's like, to counter what your teacher said, that'd be like losing the memories.
Yeah.
If we didn't read those old books, we wouldn't know what things were like back then. We wouldn't know. So
I think there's a fine line
that's
that
what
we
I was
haven't
just
gathered
about
as
to
a
say.
society yet.
I think kids should be exposed to that, but like, why does every single book have to be an 1800s to 1950?
I will say
dystopian?
most books that I was assigned in school were not, I don't know, anywhere close to like today's current age. That they're all super
The
old.
Giver's probably the closest.
Yeah.
But I think that's what something she said about Number of the Stars. Was because someone asked her about Number of the Stars, and she was like, it's so important to keep learning these stories and hearing these stories, even from different points of views. And that even goes back to like when Jonas received the sledding memory, and he was like, I'm so sorry you don't have that. And the Giver's like, you don't understand, I have millions of that same memory.
Yeah.
Because there's different points of views.
Yeah. Which is why, like, you know, he had the same memory, but he broke his leg in half. So it was sad versus...
But there's millions of happy ones, too.
Yeah.
So that would be my argument to what you're saying, but I agree with you. There's a fine line in school. Like, please don't bore us with a bajillion. Not us, because we've passed that.
Right, but... There's a very fine line that I think needs to be straddled a little bit more.
Something I always thought would have been interesting would be like, and I think I said this to you last time, if you read the dystopian, or, I mean, they're both dystopians, but like, if you read, say, 1984 or The Giver, and then you read like The Hunger Games, so you got to see both the differences. Or even if you read Frankenstein and then Edgar Allan Poe, because like, and then even someone more contemporary. Yeah. Because I think Frankenstein was what, the 1700s? Yes. And then Poe was like the 30s or something like that. Like, it's at least like this past century, not centuries ago. Yeah. So yeah, it's just interesting in that. Went on a little tangent. But yeah, it's important to learn history so it doesn't repeat itself. Exactly. Except in The Giver, they got rid of everything, so it couldn't, but then you didn't feel anything. You were just numb. So essentially things could repeat themselves, but they would have no idea. Yeah. And then they would call it the wisdom of the Giver. Yeah, I mean, planes fly over our house all the time. Right, and we don't panic and almost shoot them out of the sky. Exactly. Yeah. So did you have any others you want? Will say, something that I did want to bring up was probably just really quick. We did discuss it, like touched on it here and there, but I feel like the diction in the novel was very important. Very purposeful. The word choice. And that kind of goes back to, I don't know if I've mentioned it yet, but like the usage of the words power versus honor, that they kind of like said something about honor. Yeah, that. So in like the beginning of Jonas's trainings with the Giver, he kind of mentions like, oh, like you're super powerful because you're this receiver of memories, and so you can say whatever you want to like the elder council. And then the Giver's like, no, like I'm very honorable, I'm not powerful, and it's not the same thing. And you will understand what that means, Jonas, once you gain wisdom.
And so I think that was very interesting, especially because like a whole theme of the novel is kind of like that precision of word choice, and then we learn that the precision of word choice does not necessarily make everything better, whereas like they don't understand the concept of love because it's not precise, which I don't think love is ever precise, and it's a very hard thing to explain in a way that makes sense for every single human being because it's different to everyone.
I will say though, we'll talk about this in a second, but like I didn't really like the movie. But one of the few things in the movie that I thought was good is the giver says, "I loved Rosemary." Mm-hmm. That's his daughter. We never said that. The giver.
I think we kind of tried to lead up to that, and we totally forgot the nail on the head.
They reveal that's. You asked me earlier, did I ever cry in this book? I think I almost cried in that moment when you find out that the giver's daughter is Rosemary.
Right. So right after he describes the release to Jonas, he says like, "Rosemary was my daughter." He says it like,
look forward to release when I can see my daughter. And he was like, "You have a daughter?" And he goes, "Yeah, her name's Rosemary." And you're like.
So, I did have a quick question before we continue. Mm-hmm. Did you see that as, like, that was actually his daughter? Because they do not actually, like I said, diction is very intentional in this novel, so I did assume that it was, like, his actual daughter. But then what does actual daughter mean in this book? Does that mean, like, because he did say he had a spouse, so he was essentially could have been part of a family unit, and Jonas says, like, "Oh, I never knew you had, like, you know, children. You only said you had a spouse." So do you think it was like his daughter that was assigned to his family unit, or do you think because she also had the pale eyes that was actually his daughter, which we don't actually understand how? We only know that the birth mothers give birth, and so we assumed that it was like artificial insemination.
In the movie they assume that, but they could be making wrong assumptions.
Oh, I mean, I assume that just from the novel, but because of like these similarities, do you think that is actually his daughter, like biologically?
I don't know about the biological, but I do at least think it was... Well, first of all, I don't know if anyone is... Since we don't know, I don't know if they're biologically assigned or biologically related, but I do think it is his assigned daughter. Mm-hmm. Because, like you said, he did have a spouse, and he did describe family units in, like, kind of a personal way.
Right.
So I think he did have a family unit. He must have not applied for a son, though. Is my only wonder.
Do you think that maybe once Rosemary was released, that's why the spouse doesn't stay with him anymore, like any longer?
Which is something I want to talk about from the movie eventually, soon. But yeah, possibly, because the whole point of having a spouse was to raise the children,
right?
So you don't have your child, and they must have not have asked for a second one, or they had a special case because he was the giver. Like there could that. But I do think it was at least his assigned daughter. The biological thing, I don't know, because you did mention the theory about everyone with gray eyes.
We'll just jump into this really quick. Something that I read in the Reddit AMA with Lois Lowry from, like, I believe it was 5 years ago, and I think maybe it was something that she did after the movie had come out. She was kind of saying that she had heard a theory, or somebody had posited a theory that all the people with the pale eyes were somehow biologically related. Because we actually don't get that, like I said, description of how the birth mothers actually give birth or like who the biological fathers would be. So all the people with pale eyes could essentially be like descended from the same family members, not necessarily like they're all directly related, but you know, they come from the same like line of people. And so I thought that was really interesting because essentially what happens is that we had talked about how Jonas is able to give Gabe memories. But what we didn't talk about was that he had tried to give memories to Lily and his father, I believe.
We mentioned that he tried to give it to his friend.
Right.
With the flowers, Asher.
So he had, like, put hands on their shoulders. And Lily, after a while, started complaining, like, "Oh, you're hurting me. Like, stop grabbing my shoulder like that." And so he wasn't able to transfer the memories to them, like, no matter how hard he tried. But with Gabe, he did it by accident. And so, like we kind of discussed earlier that, you know, it could have just been like, oh, that's the gift that a few people have. But because of the similarities in the eyes, people had been, like, kind of guessing maybe that they weren't related in some way. So when he calls Gabe his younger brother, that could be true.
Yeah, I think it could be true. I don't doubt it.
Yeah.
I think it's a good observation. So it could have been his biological daughter as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was Rosemary. We were talking about something else for that reason, but oh well.
It's gone now.
something we were talking about earlier that I want to come back to real quick is the idea of choice. And something that really stuck out to me too, because I think it explains something I've always tried to explain to people weirdly, like in my own life, was just having the capacity to choose and the importance of that.
Right.
Because he even, when he started to feel color, he was frustrated he couldn't choose before that what color tunic he wanted. And he was like, I realized something like a tunic is so, that's like the shirt he wore. Yeah. Is so minuscule and doesn't matter, but it's, I want to be able to choose it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I tried to explain that. Like when I wanted a tattoo or something, and people are like, that's a stupid thing to care about. I'm like, but you don't understand. It's the choice of it.
I want it. So.
It's the matter of my ability to make my own choices and make my own mistakes. And, right. And not just tattoos, but like other things. Yeah. It's that, like, it's not about the thing, it's about the ability to make the choice of whether I should do the thing or not. And that's almost more important than the actual outcome of... Yes, and I think that's something Jonas starts to realize, too, is the freedom of choice. And I think they're tricked in, like I mentioned before, I think they might be tricked into that a little bit, like, they can choose who they volunteer, and they... But it's like... But like, teachers do stuff like that, because that was something I was taught in my education class and stuff like that, and with tutoring, is they were like, let them choose between 2 books that you've already approved. That way you're fine. Yeah. But they still have the, like, autonomy. So, not that teachers are bad for doing that, because I think that's a smart idea and better than just assigning 1 book, but still. But yeah. So I guess, I was gonna ask you, because you kind of mentioned the movie a little bit already. Do you kind of want to describe, because I haven't seen the movie, but I know Monica watched the movie for the purpose of this and comparing how it was to the novel. Do you want to give me a little backstory? Yes. The plot's the same, so that's fine. Obviously, yeah. Something's bothered me a little bit, and I know you mentioned, because when I told you I watched it, you mentioned Lois Lowry said sometimes they ignored her wishes. Right. So essentially, what I read in that Reddit AMA was that they had her essentially there. I don't know if she was like always on set or anything like that, but apparently they had they had consultations with her asking about like, well, what do you think about this? Or like, what would they do in this scenario? And so they kind of asked her a lot of questions, but they didn't always use her answers in the film. And you can tell. I think because the very first thing that happened in the film pissed me off, because he sees trees and they're green. And I was like, I don't know why, for me, I really liked the idea of red and how important the color red was. That's the first color. And they do make a point of him, the first color he realizes he's seeing is red, but they show him seeing colors. Like, they show him looking at the trees and seeing green. Yeah. And I'm just like, no, I don't like that. Another thing I didn't like, because I thought it was important, and I think we've already discussed this, is... No one's doing anything malicious, as far as we can understand, at least not in this day and age. And yet, the chief elder in the movie almost felt a little malicious. Like evil with intent. Yes, like she was doing it for it was Meryl Streep. Shout out. I know. Jeff Bridges was actually the giver, too, which was a little weird. Taylor Swift was Rosemary. Also interesting cast. Kind of took me out of the movie when I saw her. Because I was really into The Giver, and then I saw Taylor Swift's face, and I was like, this isn't The Giver. And you were like, Taylor Swift? Yeah. Why is she here? And, like, I knew she was in it, but it still surprised me. Right. Because I didn't know what character she was. In my mind, I thought she'd be Fiona, and she wasn't. So I was like, oh, maybe I... Okay, so I will, not to interrupt you, but I will say the only thing I remember is back in the day when the movie came out, I remember seeing the trailer and being pretty hyped because, like I said, I did really love The Giver. But I saw the trailer and I decided to never see the movie after the trailer. You should watch it now. Because, yeah, I probably will. But I remember seeing, like, the characters and who Jonas was. And I was like, that's not a 12-year-old. Yeah. And then I never watched the movie. And I will say that's kind of something that's a trend in many novel to, like, movie adaptations, especially of young adult content. Which I don't think that they should change because, you know, it's very important, like we said, being a 12 or 13-year-old in these novels. Or, like, even the Hunger Games, I think Katniss is supposed to be, like, 16 years old, maybe 17. I can't remember from the movie she is, but, like, the actress is definitely older. Like, you look at her, and it's, like, Jennifer Lawrence, and you're like, wow, she is not a 16-year-old. And Percy Jackson does that too.
Percy Jackson, he's also supposed to be 12. He's supposed to be a 6th grader.
He's already 16.
And he's like 16 years old.
Which was weird in Percy Jackson because the age 16 was a very important point in that book. So you were like, he's 16.
It's just like they always take him and age him up. And it's like, I understand maybe like the technicalities of why they would do that in show business, but for the adaptation to work, and I think why all those ones that we've just listed are kind of, I mean, the Hunger Games made a lot of money.
Hunger Games was also pretty good.
It's just like Percy Jackson and The Giver were essentially kind of failures. And I think that the Hunger Games honestly could have been vastly improved if maybe they had stuck to like the actual children's ages.
Harry Potter, I think, stayed to the ages.
Yeah, Harry Potter, I think they were like a few years older, but like they were all still children, and they were kind of in the same age grouping as where the characters were supposed to be in life. I just think that's really important because, like, as a 12-year-old, like I said, reading The Giver, I was like, this is me. Or, like, when I read Percy Jackson in 6th grade, I was like, hey, that's me.
Percy Jackson was weird to see when you were used to him being a child.
And it takes away, like, that aspect, especially, like, something like The Hunger Games. It was terrible because they're sending children to go be murdered. And when you see somebody who's older, you're like, obviously, it's still pretty shitty that they're getting murdered, but it's not the same as sending like a 12-year-old to go be murdered because you're starving to death.
So yeah, I was gonna say I think that's why they do it. Well, for one thing, I think it's easier to find older actors.
Yes, for the show business aspect, I understand why.
But I also think it is because I think it's almost too hard for some people. I think it's one thing, and I don't agree with it. I'm just trying to explain it.
Yeah.
I think it's one thing to read about a 12-year-old going through trauma and another thing to see it.
Yeah,
I think it's the same thing with, not the same, I'm like giving disclaimers, but also when you think about, what was it, the Vietnam War. Wars before that had never been broadcasted. You just heard about it, and then you see it, and you're like, these are children.
Right.
And I think the same thing goes with war movies. You see these actors who are in their 20s or 30s playing new soldiers.
Right.
And in reality, they're 17, 18-year-old children.
Right.
But you don't usually see it 17, 18-year-old actors because I think it would really freak people out to learn their reality.
Yeah. And it's which is bad. Interesting. Yeah. To be like, okay, well, we know that one thing is fact, but then you see it and you're like, well, that's not so bad because they're older. They have the autonomy to make their own decisions. And it's like, what 17-year-old have you met that has the ability to make any correct decision in their life?
A 12-year-old that has to trek. It was definitely different thinking about it. There's a string stuck to my finger. A 12-year-old trekking through like snow
or
and
a 12-year-old worried for the well-being of anyone else but themselves. Like that isn't something that we expect in society. Like,
so that was different about them for sure. I also but you said it perfectly, and I do think it has to do with people in our world struggle with the reality of how young people have to face traumas.
Just imagine how like much harder it could have hit if you see a 12-year-old being assigned like something they have to do for the rest of their life.
Yeah, that's what's weird too. Like I still don't know what I want to do.
Right.
I do know what I want to do. HMH, if you're watching, that was a joke. Please hire me still. Please. I'm just kidding. No, but so that I was gonna just say, back to Meryl Streep is. Something else, too, is, like, in the book, nobody knew what the Giver knew. They kind of just trusted him, where it felt like the Chief Elder did know, and she still made the conscious choice to hide it. Like, she was like, we don't want them to feel all that. And it's like, do they really?
They're not supposed to know what feeling even is.
I don't think in the book the elders know what feeling is. Also, and I think this is my projection, the Chief Elder, in my mind, I was like, is that the Giver's wife? That sounds really weird, but if you watch the movie and think about it, like,
oh, interesting.
Because they would have little, like, the way they would quarrel felt too personal.
Right.
And I don't know if that could just come from years of working together.
Yeah.
But they also, especially, it was a hot topic when Rosemary came up. Like, she said something about, like, well, when the last one failed, he was like, you know she has a name. And I was like, why? Because it's her daughter?
Right.
It's probably not. That's my little conspiracy.
Yeah.
Which I enjoy because Lois Lowry allows us to do that, so I will do it. But yeah, I was just
I'm sure she also wouldn't mind if you completely theorized insane things about the movie adaptation.
Exactly. So I don't think in the book it was that case.
Right.
But just the way they did in the movie, I was like, they feel a little too close.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I won't get too deep into the movie, but the other thing I didn't like was, as I mentioned in the book, the most important scene for me was the description of love. And that was totally changed in the movie. So they still made love a really important point, but it was Fiona.
So they added like
it was romance.
A romance that didn't need to be there.
And he stopped taking his pills so he could feel love for Fiona. He made her stop taking her pills so she could feel love for him.
I don't know how I feel about
they
that.
They kissed. She helped him escape because she felt love. Yeah. And I was like, I would get this as a standalone thing.
Right.
But it was much more beautiful, in my opinion, as the like...
To feel love as a family
as
is
a
completely different
than
unconditional. Feel something that's romantic.
To me, it is two different loves. It was that unconditional, like, deep love.
Yeah. And see, to me, that makes more sense for the movie to be more the novel to be more centered around, like, a family version of love, or, like you said, something unconditional, because that's what he ends up feeling for Gabe.
But he still has all of the things with Gabe in the movie, so it's like you still would have expected...
It's just so weird for them to kind of like add a focus to be like, oh, but Fiona.
Yeah, and they made Asher kind of a jerk, but that's...
Aww.
Like, he tattletales on him trying to escape, and like, Fiona's like, oh, I thought we were friends, but I didn't like that.
That's sad.
But it was kind of like...
I will say, something that I thought was very like kind of melancholy in the book was that since Jonas is able to like talk about all his emotions, he talks about how much love he has for Fiona and Asher, but they can never feel the love back for him. So like to add that in the movie is like, I don't know, like it takes away from that.
It does. And the other thing too is in the end when he's giving his little speech about like when he's on the brink of death, and you even mentioned what he says is, I don't care about myself, I care about Gabe. He says, oh, I care about Gabe, but I also care about making sure Asher and Fiona are okay. And I was like, this was not.
That was not.
So it really pulled away from some of the most like important points for me.
Yeah.
So Giver producers, if you see this, why did you do that? We don't need a love interest in every movie.
Yeah,
I want to see a family unit be happy.
We don't need every young adult adaptation of anything to have a love story in it. Also, when I was 12, I was not thinking about love stories so much. So, come on.
You read Twilight, though, so...
I mean, that's true. But that was based on the love
Punches
story.
down, like, embarrassed.
But
yeah, that's a bother about the movie.
There's just, like, many other important things that, like, 12-year-olds are able to grasp as young adults.
It's an easy escape.
It very much is. And I feel like it's a cop-out, in my opinion.
It was a cop-out.
I'll have to watch, obviously. But I do feel like a lot of adaptations follow that same trope of, like, it's a cop-out. Because even the Hunger Games, in the novels, they have a love triangle that's very obvious. But there's a lot more nuance in the book, rather than...
And the survival's more important than the love in the book. Mm-hmm. Speaking of cop-outs, and I feel like this is my last point I'll talk about, and I mentioned this to Marina, by the way, listeners, viewers. It frustrates me that I have, like, 5 things listed here, like, Gabe's name, the end is death, individual versus sameness, power and choice, free thinking, privacy.
Yeah.
But, like, I want to talk about why, and I urge listeners to do the same thing. Why am I sitting, like, creepy? I urge listeners to do the same thing, because it's one thing to figure out the motifs and the themes and all of that, but it's another thing to, like, think about, okay, but why is there, like, why are we talking about choice and power? And I think it goes back to that, like, feelings and... Mm-hmm. But anyways, what I was going to say is my last one, which I think is a lot of cop-out. You can hear my stomach growling, listeners, possibly, because I'm hungry, but infanticide. And I don't want to become the creepy infanticide person, but it's in this book, and it's in a lot of books, so I'll mention a lot, and I'll explain now, and I'll explain other things, why it's so brought up. And I think for writers, and this isn't against Lois or Lowry, because I would probably do the same thing as a writer. For writers, it's very easy to pull on a reader's heartstrings with the idea of infanticide, which if you didn't listen to... I can't stop thinking about my stomach growling, sorry. If you didn't listen to the Frankenstein episode, or you don't know what that is, that's basically the murder of children or infants.
Yeah. Young
which
children.
Isn't just shown with Gabe's death, it's actually kind of shown throughout. Because even the elderly can be considered infants, because just through symbolism,
it's just pretty much people who are helpless and innocent.
Helpless and innocent, and that's basically who they release. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot. I'm sorry. You can probably hear my stomach, and you're probably giving me the look of like, please stop talking, but it's distracting me. We're gonna have snackies after this. Maybe these apples. Sorry.
But the infanticide.
I will. I'm talking about it. No, but yeah, there is infanticide in the book. And as you can see, I had something written and it's not there. Oh, because I'm in the wrong section of my notes. I think it also, something that was important with it and like kind of the why is it showed that it again wasn't a utopia.
Right.
Because there shouldn't be infanticide in a dystopian.
Right.
Or in a utopia.
Yeah.
So that was kind of big. And also just like I said, when they mourn kids, but not mourn those that are released. So it's kind of like,
yeah, so they do describe, there's a part in the book when they talk about it hardly ever happens, but there are people who die, but they don't describe it as death. They describe it as loss. Mm-hmm. And so loss is different than release because loss means it was like a child or something. And they described that there was a child who was, I believe, like 4 years old who fell into the river and drowned. And so when loss happens, they say his name over and over again. And I believe the child's name was Caleb. And so they all just kind of chant Caleb, Caleb, Caleb in a really creepy, weird, cultish way until he's like released into the air. Like they release his name. So not a release, but the idea of him is like gone. And so then the following year, he mentions that the family who lost Caleb actually receives a new Caleb.
Creepy.
And so we did discuss that like the names aren't reused. There's never anybody in the community who has the same name. But if a loss has happened, then they're able to like recycle the name essentially. So they get a new replacement Caleb. Yeah. And once they name the new child, they all do the same Caleb chants, but kind of in the opposite direction. Yeah. Whereas now it's an excitement and he's back, pretty much.
But so yeah, basically this book just has a lot of subtle and overt moments of killing innocents
and killing innocents in general.
Yeah, in general.
Whereas like when she thanks Jonas for his childhood, and then there's a few instances where he's like, I wish I could just be playing on my bike and I don't want to be doing this anymore. I don't want to have the memories. Killed. And even when they have a little holiday and he doesn't have to go to training and he tries to play with his friends again,
can't do it.
They're playing a game of war, which he has never realized was war.
And the kids don't know it's war either, yeah.
And so he kind of, like you said, has that PTSD moment of seeing like the soldier next to next to him in the field dying, and he tells his friends like, we shouldn't play this, like you don't understand, but we shouldn't do this. And so essentially his innocence has been killed. And that does, even though that's not technically infanticide in the same way as
symbolism.
Killing an actual child is, it's the same idea of the loss of innocence.
And Jonas understands that the atrocity of that, and that's why he decides that, okay, they're not living in a utopia, and when he saves Gabe and changes the community. So that's the infanticide. I did remember there was one more thing I was going to mention. I'll say it super fast. You were talking about language, and one of the really important things I wanted to bring up on language, so if you read the book, think about this. The word elsewhere is used even outside of the location, which I thought was really interesting because I felt like that was purposeful with her ability to write and the awards that she's won. It feels purposeful, and the giver even says, and I have it marked somewhere, I remember the quote. It was, the giver's mind was elsewhere. And so I was just like, it feels like elsewhere for me feels like a symbolism for death. He reaches elsewhere in the end of the book. It feels like death even if he didn't die. Elsewhere is where they go after they're released. So it's just constantly the symbol for death or the afterlife. But it was just interesting whenever they would say someone's mind was elsewhere, or, oh, he went elsewhere, but not like the location. So it was like, where are they? So lots to think about with this book, lots to unpack. We could probably do a whole nother hours and hours and back and back of the Giver.
I know, we really could. We just had so much to discuss.
We did.
And there's just so little time in the world to discuss this one young adult novel.
That's short, too.
I know, it's a very short novel. It's like 200 pages.
Short, but it packed so much.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah.
Do you have anything else?
I guess nothing that's like super outside the box of what we've already discussed. So I will let that, I guess, be our ending. That was a good note to end on. Death. So, yeah.
How most things end.
How most of the novels we'll be reading go. Which is kind of sad. Somebody write a happy novel that we can read. Do those exist? We're English majors. Do we know that?
I feel like Percy Jackson ended happy.
Right. That's a good young adult happy ending. But you don't read that in school. Right. You read the first one. It's required reading in like 6th grade.
But those are still going, so we don't know if that ended happy.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so could also end in tragedy. So on that note, I guess that's going to wrap us up for today. We hope you enjoyed our discussion on
Give us
The
feedback.
Giver. So
Tell us your theories of the ending.
Right, we'd love to hear some different ideas than what we have. So next time we're actually going to be discussing Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express.
Ooh,
so we're
gonna
going
watch
in
that
the
movie
mystery section, which is pretty fun. Murder mystery.
We promised you not another dystopian.
Right. So we're just
We'll
going
be
to talk
back to
about
that.
murder instead.
More death.
But yeah, I'm a big
More-
true crime person, so this will be a pretty fun one to discuss.
I might let some things slip a little here so that the readers can do some digging because it's kind of obvious. Think about the theme of infanticide while reading.
Just always think about infanticide.
And the symbolism.
All right. So on the note of dead babies, let's read some notes. Take some notes. Read some of the novel.
I don't want to be known as the dead baby girl, but anyways.
It's already in brand. So read the book, take some notes, let us know your thoughts, and I don't know, you can give us any thoughts on this episode, 1984, or Frankenstein, or all of the above.
Or recommend books you read in school that we don't have.
That we might not be thinking of. Anything goes. If it was on your reading list in Europe or Australia and we just don't know about it in the States because we're pretty narrow-minded over here, you can let us know. But, it's just, give us any thoughts is what we're saying. We just want to discuss with you guys.
And if you liked it, please subscribe and like and do all that fun stuff that helps us out.
All of our social medias will be in description boxes on any platform that we have.
And we have the link tree so you can listen and watch on whatever platform you prefer.
Yep. And so join us next time when we're discussing murder mysteries instead. So I guess that's going to be it for today.
It is.
Bye, guys.
Bye. See you later, alligators.